Dr. Zhao Wang. Antarctica, 1998. The flat and pristine white landscape stretched far into the endless horizon, seemingly going on to the end of time. For over a century, the untamed continent had been the last great frontier. Despite humanity's best efforts, this frozen wasteland has proven impossible to conquer, providing only a narrow window for exploration and scientific research. Except for colonies of penguins, there was no other life to be found on the surface beyond the tiny handful of scientists scrambling to unlock the secrets of the world's largest desert. Magnificent, isn't it? Dr. Zhao Wang said. His colleague, Dr. Bo Chen, refused to agree as he shivered despite the thermal insulated Arctic gear he wore. There was no denying how cold it was as the harsh whistling of the wind blew across the featureless terrain. Even though it was summer, 560 kilometers inland of the Ross Sea, it was 14 below zero with wind gusts up to 40 miles an hour. None of this mattered to Dr. Wang. "I'll be happier once we find what we're looking for," Chen said. Dr. Wang couldn't help but chuckle. "Where's your sense of adventure?" he asked. "Back in Beijing, eating my mother's cooking. That is as adventurous as I typically get," Cheng answered. Wang laughed harder, which hurt a little bit as the bitterly cold air filled his lungs. "Well, you're here now. Come on, discovery awaits us." "I can feel that we're close," Wang said, urging his partner forward. "Close to what?" "The future!" Wang shouted, already pushing ahead, dragging a sled filled with supplies behind him. The two scientists, both working for the Chinese National Space Administration, had come to Antarctica to find meteorites, while the space rocks fell all over the planet, most descending into the oceans or disintegrating in the atmosphere. Here among the featureless landscapes, pristine white, the black rocks stood out like blot. However, the pickings were slim. For decades, Western scientists came here, furthering their research by collecting tens of thousands of meteorites that Dr. Wang had to venture deeper into the unknown to find decent specimens. So far, he and Dr. Chen had collected just over a ton of material, which should have been enough. However, his gut told him something important. The discovery of a lifetime had to be nearby. "We shouldn't stay out here longer than an hour. It's getting colder, and I would like to get back to camp before my fingers freeze off," Dr. Chen said. Dr. Chen was not even out of diapers when man first landed on the moon. 2 years out of college, after earning his master's, he did not share Dr. Wang's heavenly view of the universe, and saw the work they must do as being more tiresome than necessary. He was a good man nonetheless, who put in far more hours than any dozen other young astronomers he'd worked with. Nevertheless, it was clear from the moment they set down on this continent that Dr. Chen was far more comfortable looking at the stars through a telescope than doing actual field work. Not Wang. He still fondly remembered his time at Cambridge, while in his first semester at King's College, gazing up at the sky every night as Apollo 11 journeyed to the closest celestial object humanity would ever set foot on. He dreamed of being up there someday, when visions of lunar bases and international cooperation would encourage nations to put aside their petty differences and work together for the betterment of all humanity. While that dream would never come to pass as the Americans had given up on the moon, Wang never grew to become bitter and resentful like so many of his colleagues. All that man needed was something grand to help remind them how small and insignificant we were among the greater cosmoses. Dr. Wang did not take his colleagues' advice. They continued for another 2 hours as the temperature dropped another 25 degrees. "Maybe we should try and head more to the west," Dr. Wang said. He stopped, pulling out a pair of binoculars, and studied the horizon, looking for something that did not belong. Sadly, he only saw ice below a bright blue sky. "Doctor, I think we should start to head—" Dr. Cheng's words were cut short as the ice beneath his feet gave way. With a wailing scream, he disappeared beneath the surface. "Bo!" Dr. Wang rushed over to where Chen had fallen, seeing a deep fissure where the thin sheet of ice had been. Thankfully, it seemed that the ice below dropped at a slight angle and not straight down. "Bo! Can you hear me?" "I can hear you!" A faint voice called back. "Are you okay?" Wang asked. "I think so. Nothing is broken," Chen replied. "Stay put. I'll get you out of there," Wang said. Dr. Wang? I think maybe you might want to come down here. There's something you should see," Cheng said. "What is it?" "I think I might have found your golden goose," Chen replied. "Hold on. Do not move. I'll be right there, Wang called back. Dr. Wang acted against his better judgment and went down the hole. His priority should be to get Chen back to the surface regardless of what he found. But curiosity got the better of him as he carefully lowered himself. The fissure opened into a narrow cave with deep depressions indicating to Wang that something had fallen here, a meteorite long ago, and had formed a shallow crater. Once he was on firm ground, Dr. Wang ignited a torch which lit the whole area in a brilliant red hue. He saw Dr. Chen as the man was standing near the center of the crater, looking down at something. Bo, are you okay? I'm fine. But look at this, Doctor. It's amazing. My word, Wang gasped. Both men stared at a large meteorite, solid black and a diameter of 3.5 feet. Half of it lodged in the ice, the rest exposed. Doctor, wait! Chen said. Wang pulled his hand back as he glanced down at what his colleague was pointing to. It looks like small veins bonding with the ice, Dr. Wang said. This is impossible, he added. Tiny tubes barely the size of human hair spread out from the meteorite base, digging through the ice as if it were a tree grasping for a firm perch. Wang took out a pen from his pocket and touched the hairs, pulling one up like a piece of spaghetti, where it disintegrated into nothing, once severed from the body of the meteorite. How can that be? Dr. Chen asked. The answer mankind has been asking since we first looked up at the stars. And that is, are we alone in the universe? Wang answered. Come on, help me dig it out from the ice. We have to get this back to camp. Are you certain this is safe? It is much larger than the other pieces we found, Chen said. I don't care about the other specimens right now. This meteorite could be the discovery of a lifetime. Wang stopped and looked up at Chen with teary eyes. This could be the greatest discovery in the history of man. Imagine what this could mean, not just for you and me, but for the whole world. I'm not leaving this place without it. Doctor, we don't even know what this thing is. A meteorite, sure, but I don't have a good feeling about this. I think we should go back and get the rest of the team together before we come back for this thing. Examine it here to make sure it's safe to move, Chen pleaded. It was no use, as Wang went back to his hacking, breaking away large chunks of ice. With each blow, more and more of the follicles disintegrated until only the black rock remained. Help me. I can't get this back to the surface on my own, Dr. Wang said. He began to wrap the meteorite in a thermal blanket, tying it secure so it might be easier to move. When Dr. Chen bent down to help him, he was surprised by how heavy it was. Must have an iron core. Would explain how so much of it survived entry, Dr. Wang said through gritted teeth. Wang tied a rope around the rock, looping it several times before he was sure it was secure. You go up first and pull the meteorite up, Wang said. Me? Why? Chen asked. Because you're younger and stronger than I, Wang replied honestly. If you say so. Dr. Chen did as he was asked. He attached a screw-lock climbing ring to the rope and carefully began to make his way up the slope. The trek upward was far slower than his descent, and not nearly as enjoyable, he thought to himself. After 15 minutes, the brisk, cold air struck Chen, only now making him realize how much more comfortable it was down below. I'm up top, Chen said. Okay, begin to pull the meteorite up, but be incredibly careful, Dr. Wang called back. Be careful? It is a million-year-old rock that likely traveled thousands of light years. I doubt I could scratch the damn thing even if I wanted to, Chen mumbled. Gan! This beast is heavy, Dr. Chen cursed as he pulled, digging his spiked boots into the ice as he jerked the rope with all his strength. That's it! Keep that pace! Dr. Wang said from below. Beads of sweat began to drizzle from under Dr. Chen's cap as he struggled to keep his grip on the rope. Finally, after several grueling minutes, the meteorite reached the surface, sliding into place as Chen collapsed, breathing heavily from exertion. Dr. Chen eventually got up and walked over to the gorge and dropped to his hands and knees, staring down into the darkness. Dr. Wang? Are you able to get back up on your own? Or should I come down and help you? Chang asked. I can manage. Just prepare the sample for transportation. It is starting to get cold up here. Relatively speaking, of course, and the wind's stronger. We shouldn't risk the walk back to base camp just yet, Chen warned. Wait until I get up there. In the meantime, do as I say. Sighing deeply, Dr. Chen walked over to where their supplies were. He grabbed some small ski tracks that would fit under the meteorite, making transportation more manageable. We have 50 perfectly good samples back at camp to take home, and you want the haunted, glowing rock with hairs growing out of it to play with. Chen complained as he worked. Is it ready to move? Wang asked. It is, but Doctor, the weather, Chen said. Dr. Wang stood erect and sniffed the air as if he possessed some extraordinary sense to detect the slightest change in the climate. You might be right. I won't risk it. Let us get the tent set up for the night. We both need much-deserved rest, Wang said. 4 hours later, the sun had not gone down, or would it for several more weeks. Nevertheless, it was much colder than it had been as the wind blew violently. Now, the two scientists sat around a portable stove cooking their evening meal freeze-dried wonton soup. Not like Mother used to make, but not half bad for something that came out of a vacuum-sealed bag, Dr. Chen said. He tasted the soup, enjoying the aroma as it swirled around the tent. Your bowl, Doctor, Chen said, with an outstretched hand. Dr. Wang did not seem to hear him. He was too deep in his thoughts as he wrote in his leather-bound journal, as he typically did every night. Tonight, however, he filled half a dozen pages with notes while sketching out a rough image of the meteorite they had found at the bottom of the fissure. Doctor, Chen said again, nudging his colleague with his bowl of soup. Oh, I'm sorry. I was deep in thought, Wang said. Well, it has been an eventful day, Chen replied. Chen dipped the spoon into the pot and filled his bowl to the top. Bringing the dish to his nose, he took a deep breath before inhaling the mixture filled with vegetables, dumplings, and broth. Wang, on the other hand, took a single sip from his bowl and put it down as he went back to his notebook and quickly jotted down another paragraph. Do you think it is more than just another rock? Chen asked. You saw what I saw, Wang replied, not lifting his head as he wrote. Yeah, but those hairs might have been native. Perhaps some sort of fungus, Chen said. Don't be silly. Nothing can live out here for too long, Wang said. Laughing uneasy, Chen said, Little green men then? I would not dare presume. But you are thinking about it, Chen asked. Wang placed down his pencil and closed his journal. He looked over at his colleague, seeing the uneasiness in his eyes. The Americans have been here hundreds of times. As far as I know, they've found similar rocks. But if they haven't, I feel this piece might be significant, not just for China, but also for the whole world. So yes, I feel it might very well be little green men, Wang said. We have to be rational about this, Doctor. Of course. We'll do tests back at camp to determine what makes this specimen special and forward the data back to our lab in Beijing for further analysis. But just imagine, my dear young friend, the two of us might be sitting feet from the greatest discovery in human history. Or just another black rock, Chen said. Or just another black rock. But my gut tells me this is part of our destiny. The Pangu meteorite will change everything if we are proven right about what we witnessed back there, Wang said. Pangu meteorite? Chen asked. Yes, it seems appropriate, Wang said. I'm not sure I see it the way you do, Doctor. Chaos, creation, a cosmic egg? Chen asked. This is just the beginning, my friend. Where once we knew nothing, the mysteries of the universe shall be revealed in time. 2 weeks later, Dr. Wang carefully took the next sample from the Pangu meteorite, drilled from the rock's core. He dropped it into a petri dish and set it under a microscope. Simply amazing, he said under his breath. I still wouldn't believe it if I didn't see it with my own eyes, Dr. Chen said. He stood with 4 other researchers staring at a TV monitor that showed what the microscope revealed. How old is the rock again? Chen asked. 4.8 billion years old. Give or take a few millennia, Wang answered. That is older than our solar system, Chang said. Radiometric dating indicates the meteorite fell to Earth in the 1700s. One of Wang's assistants spoke. That's too long for something on this scale to have lived in the ice, Chen said. They were frozen. Maybe it just needed time to thaw, another assistant mentioned. The only problem is, we never thawed the rock. It has been kept at the same temperature as we found it, with little variation, Chen said. Dr. Chen turned to Wang as he carefully studied the monitor, watching as billions of tiny organisms swam about in the petri dish. Has there been any word from Dr. Vargas yet? Chen asked. Dr. Wang rubbed his eyes as he pulled away from the microscope. I had to send the request to Beijing for approval to reach out to a foreign agency. I told them of the importance. But 4 days, and so far, no word, Wang replied. Sorry to say, Doctor, but I don't think we need an expert to tell us what all of us already know. You found the first confirmed life outside our planet, Chen said. Since the first samples were taken from the meteorite and put under a microscope, a whole new world of understanding was opened, not to mention countless questions about what exactly they were looking at. Dr. Wang laughed. I appreciate the excitement. However, I would like to avoid making the same mistakes the researchers who found ALH 84001 made. I want no room for debate as to what we've discovered. Oh, I think there will be plenty of debate, Doctor, Chen said. This could cause everyone on the planet to question humanity's place in the universe. This might affect religion, philosophy, or even the origin of life on our planet. I am sorry, Dr. Wang, that I ever doubted you while we were out there. You were right. These past few weeks have been the most amazing adventure. Dr. Chen swore he could detect a hint of a tear welling up in the corner of Wang's eye. Everyone in the room agreed and offered their encouragement, all grateful to be given a chance to be a part of this. It was then that everyone's attention was pulled away from the TV monitor and directed outside as they heard what sounded like a large helicopter approaching their facility. What in the world? Dr. Wang said, and quickly made his way over to the hatch. Dr. Chen followed as both men grabbed their coats and headed outside, where they promptly saw a pair of military Chang Z-8 transport helicopters coming toward their camp before landing. We weren't expecting a resupply, right? Chang asked. Not for another week, Wang replied. The older doctor looked worried, almost sensing whoever was about to come out of that bird was not bringing with them any good news. The moment the rotors stopped, the rear hatch to both choppers opened and allowed 24 Chinese soldiers out. A pair of soldiers moved aggressively toward Dr. Wang and Chen, their weapons held low and fingers off the trigger. But it hardly mattered as the two men quickly threw up their hands. Whoa, whoa, whoa! What the hell is going on here? Dr. Chen asked. Dr. Zhao Wang and Dr. Bo Chen. I am General Fei Li. I'm here on orders from Beijing to look at your Pangu meteorite, if you please. The officer who led the soldiers said as he approached behind his men. Do I have a choice? Dr. Wang asked. Oh, dear doctor, we all have choices. You may not like the outcome, however. Li answered, his voice calm yet commanding. And please, lower your hands. We are all countrymen here, he added. Both Wang and Chen were apprehensive. Nonetheless, they did as they were told. Please, follow me inside, Wang said. How do you know he is telling the truth, or even who he says he is? Dr. Chen said quietly. I don't believe we are in the position to argue with him, Dr. Wang replied. As Dr. Wang led the party inside, he immediately saw the sudden fear and uncertainty on his team's faces. Quickly, he spoke loudly. Please, everyone, we are hosting guests who have come a very long way to see for themselves our discovery. General Li, this is my research staff. A pleasure to meet all of you. I have read each of your files, the brightest minds our country has to offer. Dr. Wang has chosen his team well, and your government is thankful for your service. General Li said, sounding like a showman as his soldiers moved swiftly around the lab, taking positions around Wang's staff. Dr. Wang moved over to his workstation, with Li right behind him. As you can see, the samples are highly active and seem to be reproducing fairly quickly, Wang said. And these samples come from inside the meteorite? General Li asked. They do, Wang answered. Are you certain they're not terrestrial? Li asked. Absolutely, Wang said. However, I do think I should point out something important. While this appears to be a complex life form, if I had to guess, I think it draws a lot of similarities to a virus, Wang added. Yes, your colleagues back in Beijing have testified to that, which is why I'm here, Li said. He had an odd kind of smile on his face that made Dr. Wang's skin begin to crawl. General? Wang asked. Chairman Z has ordered all of your research and the meteorite to be placed under direct control of the People's Liberation Army. Effective immediately, Li said. Military control? This research is ours! It belongs to the CNSA! Dr. Cheng said. He foolishly rushed forward, but could not get further than 2 steps before one of the soldiers rammed the butt of his rifle into the doctor's gut. General! That was uncalled for! Apologies. I have my orders, which I will be carrying out despite the protest of your team, Li said. I don't think you understand. While this finding is groundbreaking, it is potentially hazardous. If my data is correct, what we are looking at might be the most virulent life form ever discovered. Dr. Wang stepped closer to General Li, wanting to make sure every word he spoke was understood. General, This thing has survived not only the harshest climate on our planet for hundreds of years, but it has also endured for billions of years in the vacuum of space, where it was exposed to unimaginable levels of radiation. Yet, it still survived. This is not something that we should keep to ourselves or treat lightly. To be frank, we aren't technologically advanced enough to understand this thing without outside help. Even then, it might take decades before we begin to scratch the surface of what this discovery means. The only thing that matters, Doctor, is... what did you name it? Pangu? Might be the greatest weapon our nation can ever hope to possess. One that can very well tip the balance of power, Lee said. He instructed his men to begin collecting all of Wang's research and the meteorite itself, pushing the staff into the corner where they could not interfere. A weapon? Are you a madman? Didn't you listen to a word Dr. Wang said? This thing is a menace. The genetic material inside the capsid alone is far more complex and larger than even the most dangerous virus found on Earth. And that means? Lee asked, not caring. This means it holds within it the potential and adapts to anything it comes in contact with. If mishandled, it could mean the end of... well, everything, Chen answered. Which is why it should be in the hands of the PLA, Lee said callously. No! You can't do this, Chen said. The young doctor bolted, rising to his feet as he surged towards General Lee. However, before he could reach the man, the general pulled out a pistol and fired once. Dr. Chen stumbled forward, a look of disbelief on his face as he pulled his hand away from his chest with one final breath. Chen collapsed to the ground, falling to his knees before landing on the floor. A pool of bright crimson quickly began to form under him and spread as several of his colleagues began to wail uncontrollably. Damn you! Dr. Wang said. He rushed over to Chen and knelt, rolling the younger man over onto his back. Chen's eyes were open, but there was no life left in them. You didn't have to do this! Dr. Wang said. Yes, quite unfortunate. Dr. Chen was a promising astronomer. I would advise, next time you control your people better, Lee said. He holstered his weapon and turned back as his soldiers began packing all of Dr. Wang's work. What about the rest of my team? Are you going to kill us too? Wang asked. Please, what do you take me for? We're all countrymen here, Dr. Wang. But do not fear, you will still get to work with your rock and unlock all its secrets. I won't help you turn it into a weapon, Wang said defiantly. Lee grabbed Wang and lifted him back to his feet. Pulling the older man closer to him, he spoke in a low and intimidating voice. You will. For their sake. Wang glanced over at his team. All of them were held at gunpoint. Each one stood frozen with fear, holding one another as they worried if they were next to be killed. Looking back at Lee, Wang said, I will do as you ask. Just don't hurt anyone else. Very good. Gather all your research and help my men load it into our choppers. I expect everything to be done within the next hour, as you say. Wang said in a low voice. Turning to his colleagues, he said to all of them, Please, help the general and his men. They hesitated for a moment, but soon did as asked. I need to transfer the data we have to a secure drive. I wouldn't trust that your men know how to do that without damaging my data. Of course. Do whatever needs to be done. Wang quietly walked over to his computer, glancing back as Dr. Chen's body was lifted by two soldiers and taken outside. He sat and began to work quickly on his computer, doing what he was asked, but when no one was looking, grabbed a small file that he had readied to send to another colleague in South Korea. It was his only hope of getting what was discovered out to the world. He feared if the Pangu meteorite remained a secret, it might very well have terrible consequences for the world. With the attached file that only covered the most basic information about the meteorite and its early findings, Dr. Wang wrote a simple message. I hope you know what to do before it is too late. He clicked send as General Lee stepped over to him. Is everything going well, Doctor? Yes. I'm nearly finished transferring the files. Good. Do be thorough. We wouldn't want to leave anything behind. Of course, Wang replied. Less than an hour later, Dr. Wang rode in the military helicopter, looking out the port window at his abandoned base. With him in the same chopper was his research team. Lying between them on the floor, put into a body bag, was Dr. Chen. which everyone tried not to look down at. Wang wondered what a terrible future might be in store for him, and if his friend in Korea would understand his message and do the right thing. If not, he worried what his discovery would mean for the world. Not soon, but much further down the road. He knew if humanity wasn't prepared, the Pangu meteorite had trapped within it the power to reshape the world. That fact frightened him that he wished he'd never found the damn thing. Yuyan, Caxian District, the People's Republic of China, 2014. Yuyan was 10 years old. She lived in a small fishing village along a tributary of the Yangtze River in the Caxian District. Life was uneventful and straightforward. In the morning, she would go to the shore and help her father pull his nets out of the river. Usually, they would not catch much, but it was enough to feed the family along with a bowl of rice. She would then spend the rest of the morning and part of the afternoon in school. It was not anything fancy, certainly not like the education she would have received if she lived in a big city. But she learned enough to get by, to read, write, do math, and science. She dreamed big, as she wanted to travel overseas and attend a college in Japan, South Korea, or even the United States. She did not know what she wanted to do. Her opinion on topics changed from week to week. Today, she thought she might be an oceanographer. She had just watched an old video of Jacques Cousteau and thought traveling to the deepest depths of the ocean would be amazing. Her mind was filled with all the beautiful discoveries she would find, from lost cities to pirate gold and sea monsters. After school, she spent some time playing with her friends before returning to the shore to help her father put his nets back in the water before returning home for dinner. She would go to sleep and lay awake for a few more hours, staring up at the stars, dreaming of other places and wonders she'd never imagined. Tomorrow, she thought she might want to be an astronaut, as the full moon was stunning right now. With each day that passed, however, life became more challenging. The government was building a massive dam called the Three Gorges. It was said to be the 8th wonder of the world, which meant nothing to you. What she did know was its construction was making the river polluted. Each morning she headed to the banks to help her father. Fewer and fewer fish were being caught. Those that were, many of them were already dead or sick. The same was happening to every other fisherman in the village. Then, a government representative in a slick black suit showed up one afternoon and told everyone how important the dam was. China was stepping out of the shadows and becoming one of the greatest powers of the world. This also meant nothing to you, as she hardly understood his fancy words. And it also meant nothing to the adults. The man left, but with a demand that everyone in the village had to go. He threatened that the entire valley would be under 1,000 feet of water in a few months. She remembered how angry her father and the rest of the townspeople were as they ran the government man out. Progress, nevertheless, continued. Less fish was caught, but it seemed pointless even bothering to check the nets. Soon, her father gave up altogether. More and more families also began leaving the village. That meant many of Yu's closest friends and schoolmates were gone. There was not much for her to do. Then, last month, it was decided that the school, too, would close. Yu still dreamed, but it was becoming less vivid, as her mind was no longer stimulated with knowledge of the outside world. Her home became less secure as her father and mother began to fight a lot. With her father often getting physical with Yu's mother, she wanted to leave. But Yu's father said this village was their home. It had been their home for 20 generations. But times were changing. Before long, more than half the people had gathered everything they owned and walked out of the valley. Yu now spent her days walking along the banks of the river, which was now ashen white. Garbage and other material washed ashore, clogging the narrowest parts of the flow, that the villagers had to build a barrier to keep the filth out. 2 days ago, another government man arrived and demanded that everyone leave. This man was assaulted and nearly killed. Yu had cried as she watched her father beat the man senseless. She felt that life could not get worse, despite her stomach constantly rumbling from the lack of food. That was until 2 weeks ago. Yu walked along the riverbanks, picking up trash and examining it, wishing the garbage still had food left in it. Rotting fish made the air smell horrible, and drinking the water even boiled. It gave Yu the runs. She tried to play with her friends as they would pick up random objects and use them as toys, which she was doing the afternoon the helicopters showed up. She was lucky enough to find a ball that washed ashore. It was mostly flat, but still had some bounce left in it. It was like finding gold for the children as they gathered around her and kicked the toy, laughing as they had done before the river killed the fish and made people sick. Then suddenly, she stopped playing as she turned her attention to the sky, as the air filled with the hum of helicopters. The helicopters then spread out and formed 2 long lines. Booms extended out from both sides of the choppers as they lined up to pass over the village. The villagers came rushing out of their homes and gathered in large groups, looking out as the helicopters approached. As they neared the village, a green mist was sprayed from the booms. You thought it smelled like rotten eggs, as the cloud fell to the earth and coated everything in a thin layer. When it touched her skin, it began to sting and turn red. She could not help herself from vomiting as the helicopters flew overhead. The whole village was sprayed with mist, with each of the people sharing the same sensation that you just experienced. They began to panic and cry out, with the children racing to their parents' arms. When the helicopters completed, they passed, they disappeared back around the mountain, but not before another chopper appeared. This time, as it passed over the village, it dropped little pieces of paper, which fluttered down and stuck to everything the mist had touched. You picked up the paper and read it. It said the mist was to help the river get well, and not to be alarmed. You knew something didn't feel right, however. After a couple of days, the village began to settle down. The people started to forget the incident and tried to get back to their lives. As gross as it was, some even believed the mist would help the river, as they eagerly waited for the fish to return. You still distrusted the notes, primarily when the first group began getting deathly sick 5 days later. The sickness spread quickly, as those worse off could not move from their beds. They coughed up blood, which drizzled from their eyes, ears, nose, and mouths. Blindness followed, then the rest of the senses before the body began to convulse. Yu's mother was among the first to die. After suffering horribly for a week, she remembered walking with her father as they buried her mother. She cried all day and all night as her father, already starting to feel sick, worsened. He locked himself in his room and would not allow you to see him. By this time, nearly every family had died or was close to death. You wandered the village. There were not enough people well now to bury the dead or do anything with the bodies. Even the animals, cats and dogs, pigs and birds, had all died. You stood over a dead dog, looking down at it. A strange orange growth had consumed the body and had rooted itself to the ground. One morning, as you started to feel sick, she slowly inched her way to her father's room and dared to slide back the door. The smell struck her like a bat across the face. She fought back the urge to vomit and opened the door completely. Her father laid on his bed, his body all twisted and mangled. Ugly growths had torn out of his body, rooted to the floor. She wanted to touch him and drag him out of the house, but knew it was better to do nothing. So she slid the door shut and let him be. The following morning, Yu was the last person in the village still alive. She felt delirious. She was wet all the time, as it felt like her body was melting from the inside out. Strange, painful growths burst through the skin on her arms and back, looking like coral as it dried. She wandered down to the river and grabbed her father's nets, pulling them out only to find no fish. Yu then made her way over to the schoolhouse and sat. She flipped through the magazine, an old copy of National Geographic, and marveled at the pictures and vivid colors. She managed a faint smile as she dreamed of her future and everything she wanted to do. Before closing her eyes, Yu thought she would become a photographer and take beautiful pictures so that other children could see beautiful places when she grew up. Yu heard voices outside the school. She sat at her desk, barely able to move, as the growths had rooted themselves to the table. However, she was alive, but her breathing was shallow, and only one eye could be opened. She saw a man in a funny yellow-looking rubber suit and a gun enter the school. He flashed his light across the room before settling on her. He must have seen she was still alive as he radioed for help. A moment later, half a dozen men in identical yellow suits came into the school and began poking at her. You tried to speak to them and tell them it hurts when they cut the roots that held her down on the desk, but she could not manage to say the words. She listened as the men talked to one another. Everyone was mostly talking to one individual who was the most important man in the group. She heard them call him General Lee. She did not understand most of what they were saying, as they used words she had never learned in school. They were amazed she was still alive, as they stated that everyone in the village was dead. But you knew they were not here to save her, as they hardly paid attention to her, but instead acted like she was a fish caught in their nets. When Yu had finally freed, she was laid on the ground before a strange plastic bed was brought into the school. Lights flickered from its panels. Before putting her on it, the men took blood from her arm, attached wires to her body, and stuck needles in her. She was then placed inside the plastic bed, where it was sealed shut. As she was wheeled outside, the sun blinded her. She began screaming. Not out loud, but in her head. She would never see home again. Tessa Winter, New York City, New York, May 1st, 2018. Tessa was so excited she could hardly contain herself as the ferry pulled into the dock. She had dreamed of coming to New York City to see the Statue of Liberty her whole life. And who better to do it with than her new fiancé, Mark? The entire trip had been a surprise, a college graduation gift from Mark to her. She'd met him at UCLA 3 years ago and instantly fell in love with the big lug when she first saw him on the football field. She secretly stalked him for the next 2 months, following him to practice, making sure she took the same chem class as him, and even cozying up to his sister, who also attended the school. Finally, when she could not take it any longer, she asked him out on a date. Being the big sports star, he was used to girls wanting to go out with him, so it wasn't a big deal to say yes. After all, Tessa was pretty enough with her auburn long hair, slender frame, and piercing green eyes. The two hit it off like rock stars, laughing the night away and never finding it challenging to settle on a topic of conversation. The next 3 years were wonderful. Life continued as their romance became more serious. As graduation neared for both, they looked forward to their futures, with Mark entering sports medicine and her wanting to become an engineer. Neither could imagine their lives without the other. So, to celebrate, Mark booked a flight to New York and bought an engagement ring. He proposed to her over dinner with the ring lying on the top of the plane tickets. She beamed with joy as she accepted both the ring and the tickets, with the Statue of Liberty being the first thing she wanted to see. They landed last night, stayed at an expensive hotel, had a fantastic dinner, went back to the hotel, made love, and fell asleep in each other's arms. In the morning, Tessa was up before sunrise, as if it was Christmas morning. Even with the misty overcast that hung over the city, threatening rain in the mid-afternoon, they were off to catch the ferry to Liberty Island. Tessa latched onto Mark's arm as they stepped off the boat and entered the ferry docks. The pavilion was ahead of them, filled with gift shops, restaurants, and a museum. Flagpole Plaza was easily seen from her vantage point, with a large American flag flapping erratically in the wind. Of course, the tiny island's main attraction was Lady Liberty herself, which loomed over everything. "Oh, just look at her, Mark," Tessa said. "Did you know that the statue is over 300 feet tall and made of 30 tons of copper and 125 tons of steel?" "I know. I read the same pamphlet as you, dear," Mark replied. Tessa smiled as Mark shivered in her arms. He was born and raised in California, so being in New York during an unseasonably cold streak wasn't something he was used to. Still, it gave her an excuse to hold on to him longer, at least until some other distraction pulled her away. "It was a gift to America from the French people," Tessa continued, "although we had to pay for the construction of the base it stands on." "We? I don't remember that coming out of my paycheck." "Well, I mean, people back then had to pay for it, silly." "Must have been a lot of money." "Oh, it was." While still in conversation with Mark, a man bumped into Tessa, nearly knocking the two of them to the ground. "Hey!" Mark said. The man, however, ignored them as he walked away quickly. "God damn it! That rude bastard!" Mark said. "Hey, buddy!" "Just let it go, Mark." Tessa did not say it aloud, but something troubled her about the man as a cold shiver ran down her back. He was tall and lean with a shaved head. She could barely make out a tattoo under his coat that covered his neck. He carried a duffel bag, even though such baggage was not allowed on the boat. She wondered how he managed to get it on the island, and more importantly, what was inside it. As Mark broke from her grip and headed off to chase the rude man, Tessa noticed another group. All of them wore dark clothes, shaved heads, and had tattoos. More importantly, there was something about their eyes and hinted at their edginess. Tessa looked around frantically for a ranger. "Mark! Hey, asshole! I think you owe my fiancé and—" Tessa saw everything that happened in the next moment, as if time had slowed to a crawl. The man with the bag turned when Mark reached out to him. In the same motion, his hand came out of his pocket and a pistol held firmly in his grip. He aimed it at Mark. A shot echoed across the island as a 9mm bullet tore through Mark's forehead. Blood and brains blew out the back of his head as Tessa screamed as Mark's body dropped to the ground. Tessa noticed the other men joined their comrade as he turned and continued to fire his gun at everyone, man, woman, and child nearest to him. Finally, the gunman turned and aimed his weapon at Tessa, who stood frozen in fear. She was unsure. She was unsure she was shot until a hot liquid began running down her pants. As if she had just spilled tea, she collapsed, screaming with the realization that she had been shot. Pulling her hand to her side, she saw blood drizzling from her stomach. More gunfire erupted soon after, now more violent and with a higher frequency. The rest of the gang had pulled an arsenal from the duffel bag and were spraying bullets into the crowd. Tessa felt someone try to grab her as she was dragged. Glancing back, she saw a young man. She realized he must have seen her go down, and despite the fear that was evident on his face, he must have felt he needed to do something. He should have taken care of himself, as he was suddenly struck 2 times. Blood sprayed across Tessa's face as her savior went down. Turning, she saw the man that murdered Mark walked up to her. He held a small rifle, an M4 she recognized. Tessa's sister was in the military, so she knew a few firearms. "Please, don't," Tessa said. The man stared at her. She had never seen such hatred in someone's eyes before. What would make someone do this? She thought. To want to hurt innocent people. Why? Her plea did not matter as the man fired. Tessa did not die right away as her head hit the ground. She felt the odd sensation of blood coming out of her head, pooling in the dirt she landed in. She saw through blurry eyes the man who shot her. He looked down at her and spat as if she had personally offended him somehow before turning and continuing to fire into the crowd. Mark, she thought. She wanted more than anything to be with him in these final moments. She did not believe in heaven or hell, but with her last thought, she hoped she would meet him again in a better place. Dr. Juliette Wu, New York City, New York, May 3rd, 2018. Dr. Juliette Wu gripped the armchairs tightly with both hands, so much so that her perfectly manicured nails dug into the seat cushions. She hated flying when the weather was awful, which it was right now. She landed 20 minutes ago in a government jet at LaGuardia Airport after flying in from Atlanta. Once on the ground, she was back in the air moments later, riding in a National Guard helicopter to take her to Liberty Island. A trusted colleague, Dr. Amy Coolidge, was with her, who was not nearly as bothered as she. Dr. Coolidge read through the report prepared for them on a tablet, going over the last bit of information uploaded to the CDC server moments ago. Without looking up from her tablet, Dr. Coolidge said, "The gas has completely dissipated around the island. There is some residue left inside the monument, so I wouldn't go around touching things until the cleaning crew is finished." Wu did not reply. She looked out the window as the chopper did a flyover of the island. She saw dozens of police boats on the water, blocking off access to the Hudson River as they formed a perimeter that stopped any civilian craft from getting near the scene. Along the New Jersey shoreline stood thousands of people. This was as close as anyone could get. How could we have allowed this to happen again? Wu asked herself. If only those bastards in Washington had listened to me. All of this could have been prevented. Of course, Dr. Wu wasn't sure she could have prevented the attack on Liberty Island, but she had to believe that things might have turned out differently if she had had her way. She worked for the Center of Disease Control for much of her professional life, specializing in advanced biological and chemical weapons and warfare. Such tools had become the preferred means of terror for extremist groups and rogue nations since the Soviet Union's fall. For the past 30 years, cities worldwide have been attacked using the stockpiles from the Cold War. Every agent known to man had been mislabeled, sold, stolen, or smuggled to the 4 corners of the globe after the fall. But no attack had ever happened on American soil. Most believed we were safe from such heinous acts of violence and our borders too well protected for such weapons to be smuggled in. Yet, as her helicopter circled the symbol of freedom, terrorism had reached home and struck a deadly blow. How unimaginative we are, she thought. She had been the lone voice screaming in a hurricane of doubt and mistrust. She advocated for a new agency to be formed, one that would be better prepared to handle such a situation. She knew police were not ready for such an attack, and that the military was too much of a blunt instrument. Something else was needed, an agency that could combine the Army's brute force with the CDC's brains. But she was laughed out of every congressional hearing she argued her case to. Unnecessary expenses, a waste of resources, and an over-aggressive response to a problem that does not exist, were the remarks she was often told. Who was laughing? Thousands were dead, and the whole world watched it happen on social media. "Dr. Wu," the pilot called out. "We've been cleared to land." "Thank you," she replied. Wu took a deep breath as the chopper rocked, as it hit a rough patch of air. It was raining outside, with flashes of lightning streaking through the sky a few miles outside the city. If the chopper didn't land soon, she was afraid she might throw open the hatch and leap outside any moment now. "Doctor," Coolidge said as she held out her tablet for Wu to take, "you should have a look at this." Wu took the tablet and saw a video file was loaded on the screen. Its watermark indicated it was from 2 days ago, just minutes before the early morning attack. It would appear hackers broke through the NSA firewall again and uploaded the video on the net. "We're trying to take it down, but it already has 15 million views in the past 30 minutes, Coolidge said. Wu knew it was to be expected. People around the world wanted answers. The attack happened live, with billions watching, as thousands of innocent people were murdered in cold blood. The government shut down the feed as quickly as possible, but more and more videos had been popping up online ever since. Another failure of just how unprepared the country was for such an event as this. Wu noted. Wu played the video. It showed a young woman who was being filmed by a man, probably her husband. The girl was smiling as she acted like she was giving a grand tour of the island. They were standing near the statue, with the camera panning up before focusing on her. Wu noted that she appeared to be in her late 20s, was attractive, with blonde hair, and spoke with a French accent. "Paige and Axel Couture," Dr. Coolidge said, as Wu watched the video. She picked up another tablet and was reading through the files of the victims, French nationals. Husband and wife. Last month she was hired by a major law firm in the city. They'd only just moved to New York last week. Wu did not say anything. She just watched the video, noting that the couple seemed very happy and excited to be in a new city to start a brand new life together. Wu watched as Paige continued to speak to her parents, when a series of pops were heard in the distance. He panned behind him, but nothing could be seen just yet. Wu noticed that he was not the only one startled by the noise. Many of the tourists had also turned their attention to where the sounds were coming from. More pops echoed as it was starting to dawn on people what the sounds were. Panic filled the air as a mass of people began running into the flame, racing away from the sounds that grew in ferocity, until it was clear to everyone it was not firecrackers, but a gunfight. A mass of people collided with Axel, knocking his phone from his hands before it was picked up again. It continued to record as explosions could be heard in the distance. Axel and Paige then ran into Fort Wood, the old military fortress that was the base for the Statue of Liberty. There was more shooting. Only this time, it wasn't coming from outside, but inside the fort. People began screaming at what sounded like an automatic weapon unloaded into them. For a brief moment, as Paige and Axel ran, Wu saw the gunmen, 2 individuals wearing ski masks, fire into the fleeing crowd. Axel must have been struck as the phone fell and the video cracked. Wu could hear Paige screaming as the video continued streaming for a few more seconds before it stopped. The phone probably crushed from the stampede. It was the same thing Wu had seen a dozen times over already. People filmed their first visit to Liberty Island before the attack, and hundreds more started when the assault began. Each one showed the same story from different perspectives. Wu had never seen anything quite like it. The attackers were well prepared, and some managed to smuggle in enough weapons to overwhelm the park rangers in a matter of minutes, all the while planning this operation without the knowledge of the FBI or CIA. This was an embarrassment of colossal proportions. Wu knew that heads were going to roll for this, and rightfully so, as much as she hated to think about it. This event opened a door for her proposal. They all would have to listen to her. Wu looked out the window one last time as it made its final pass around the island, before it would come down on land. She saw that a boat was docked at the northwest end of the island. Federal officers poured over it as the second group of terrorists used the vessel came ashore moments after the first attack. These men were heavily armed, with additional weapons, ammo, and body armor for their comrades who were already wreaking havoc. They were prepared for war when the police eventually stormed the island. But unknown at the time, these men also brought a dozen oil drums filled with nerve gas containers. The chopper touched down. Before the doors were pulled open, Dr. Wu and Coolidge sealed their helmets not to be accidentally exposed. As her colleague had already said, most of the gas had dissipated with the help of the rain. Otherwise, there was a risk the wind might have carried it to New Jersey, Brooklyn, or Manhattan. "Dr. Wu!" an Army officer said as he ran up to greet her. "I'm Colonel Williams. I'm glad you could get here so quickly." "As am I, Colonel. What is the situation?" Wu asked. She and Coolidge walked with the officer as they headed towards the statue. Our people are washing down everything, as you can see. Wu looked over and saw personnel armed with hoses spraying every building, object, and blade of grass. Even though the rain had likely washed away most of the gas, they needed to make sure the entire site was decontaminated before forensic teams could come to the island. Because of that, bodies that had been dead for 3 days still lay where they fell. Wu tried as best she could not to focus on the carnage, as the ground was littered with corpses. The sight of so many made her stomach churn as the terrorist killed without discrimination. There were more bodies as well. Newer. These consisted of police and federal agents sent to retake the island. The attackers had waited until hundreds of government agents were on the island before revealing their motive for coming here. Do you have an accurate count of the dead, Colonel? Wu asked. Maybe 200 killed when the attack began. Another 20 or so were executed afterward. And he paused for a moment, barely able to comprehend the numbers. Over 3,000 when the gas was detonated, including every man sent to retake the island from these bastards. As they reached the statue's main entrance, the colonel stood before Wu and Coolidge before ordering his men to open the doors. You should be warned before going inside. As bad as it is out here, it's nothing like what is in there. I understand, Wu said with a bit of hesitation. As the doors were opened, Wu was greeted with an incredible sight. Hundreds of bodies lay on top of one another. The gas was designed to target the nervous system, and as such, the victims were all bent and twisted. They would have convulsed so horribly that every bone in their arms, legs, and back snapped before death took them. Worse, each dead body had their eyes and mouths open, which were bulging, frozen in time in agonizing pain, before death mercifully took them. I'm sorry, Doctor. I can't, Coolidge said as she fell back against the doorframe. She was about to throw up inside her suit. She fought back the urge nonetheless. It's okay. Take her outside, please, Wu said. She isn't the first one to react like that. I've had hardened veterans who've seen shit you wouldn't believe keel over. If you need a moment as well, I understand. I'll be fine, Colonel, Wu said. Colonel Williams continued to show Wu around. She could see she was in the pavilion where most of the hostages had been kept. It was from here that 20 people were executed when their unreasonable demands weren't met. The park staff was brought up and kept with the survivors, filling the cafeteria and gift shops when the pavilion filled up. At the time, no one saw the gas canisters the terrorists brought ashore. Wu knelt and examined one canister. It looked innocuous, a tall metal cylinder that could have been an oxygen tank. Wu knew otherwise. The VX gas had gone missing from the Soviet stockpile decades ago, before passed around the black market for years, until finally making its way to the US. It was then smuggled in oil drums, bought by ultra-nationalist extremist group who planned to spread their message globally. Wu recalled their demands over the past 48 hours. It included the president's removal, all federal prisoners' release, and a new constitution drafted. When their demands were not met, they executed a hostage. It was all a ploy to lure government forces to the island. A strike team was quickly assembled. The NYPD and federal SWAT teams were readied. Along with military help, a 3-stage attack followed as the combined forces hit the island from sea and air. The terrorists were quickly overwhelmed and gunned down as the island was retaken in the opening minutes. Of course, the real fight would always be for the statue, but then it happened. Once the strike teams were firmly on the island, the terrorists activated their real agenda. The VX was hidden and off everyone's radar. Placed around the island and within the same area, the hostages were held. Once the police began their final push to take the statue, the gas was detonated. Everyone died. Terrorists, civilians, and law enforcement alike. The mission had always been one way for the attackers, with their message sent and heard. Can the bodies be moved? Wu asked. It's going to be a while. Not all the canisters detonated, so it will have to be cleared. And then there's the matter of decontaminating the bodies and all the forensic work. Not to mention, Wu held up her hand, wishing for the colonel to stop talking. I understand. Thank you, Colonel. I would appreciate a moment alone. I understand. Wu walked around for a bit. She wanted to burn everything she saw into her mind, so she would never forget. She had to believe this could have been prevented, and all these lives saved. These people weren't just numbers. They had lives and dreams, friends and families. They represented the absolute best of us, as well as the worst. Wu saw a face she recognized. Kneeling next to the body, she saw the woman in front of her was Paige. She survived the opening assault and had become one of the thousands of hostages. She was dead, broken and twisted like everyone around her, having died in agony when the gas was released. I'll make them listen. I swear it. Wu promised Paige. Washington, D.C., U.S. congressional hearing, 72 hours later. 14 Congress members sat in silence as they watched footage as the attack unfolded. All of it is taken from body cameras. More than a few of them were visibly shaken from what they observed as federal agents conducted their raid to free the hostages. As Dr. Wu had seen with her own eyes once the strike force was deep enough into the trap, the chemical weapons hidden across the island detonated simultaneously. It didn't matter where they were, as the chemical used was absorbed through the skin, resulting in a horrific death in under 4 minutes. Wu had seen enough, as she purposefully did not turn her gaze to the large TV monitors in the chambers, but instead collected her next series of notes highlighting what she would say once the video stopped. Another 15 minutes went by as the congressman watched the after-action report as Wu and the CDC team sent to Liberty Island recorded the aftermath. This caused even the most hardened politicians in the room to break down when they saw the cost of human lives. However, when the recording stopped, the room's lights brightened, allowing Wu to continue as the members collected their thoughts and wiped their eyes. 4,567 dead. Women, children, men, and the old. Park rangers, Liberty Island staff, and over 500 police and federal agents sent to rescue these poor people are among the dead. Including among this death toll is 14 terrorists, Wu said. The TV switched to photos of the suspected terrorists that showed their living images alongside their corpses. All of them suspected domestic terrorists, and all followers of the Roger Crow movement. Yesterday, federal agents raided the Crow compound in Montana, killing 6 members and arresting 18 others, with 2 of our agents were killed in action. We found these in the compound as we conducted our search. Wu indicated a stockpile of canisters laid out, the same type used on Liberty Island. Each of these canisters, 16 in all, held enough VX gas to kill every living being in a 2-mile radius. We believe the VX gas was smuggled into the country from Eastern Europe among the massive stockpiles of chemical, biological, and viral weapons lost and unaccounted for over the past 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union. We have evidence that the Crow movement was planning another attack if we didn't hit them when we did. Wu paused as she allowed her words to sink in. She knew that each of the congressmen had already been briefed on the notes she read. This was nothing more than a formality to set the stage for her real reason for meeting with them this morning. The deaths of all these people on Liberty Island is our fault, she said. Her blunt words struck home for several Congress members that looked as if they were about to speak in some foolish attempt to divert the blame from what happened away from themselves. But Wu did not allow them. I have stood before this committee on 5 separate occasions over the past 6 years, urging you to wake up and realize that our old ways of protecting this country and its citizens are archaic. The boys we sent in to save those hostages weren't prepared for the type of war that Roger Crow and his movement were fighting. The same kind of biological war that has been raging across the world for the past 30 years. We thought after Moscow in 1999, it couldn't happen here. We thought after Tokyo in 2002, it couldn't happen here. We thought after Rio de Janeiro, 2009, it couldn't happen here. Well, guess what? It has! Wu's words were like knives, stinging to the core of the congressional members who listened. Many of them not liking what they were hearing, but would not dare to open their mouths to say otherwise. The CDC is too weak and can only act passively against such threats. The military and federal law enforcement is a blunt instrument, lacking the finite tools to carry out precision operations that would have saved 4,500 American lives. Wu stood from behind her desk and approached the members. She felt like she was an actor who gave the performance of her life. Addressing the audience as the play reached its grand climax, she had them right where she wanted them. My proposal for a new federal agency, with the mandate to fight extreme threats that bombs, guns, and fighter planes can't destroy. The Center for Epidemic Research and Control is the scalpel our country needs to ensure that what happened in New York City never happens again. She went over the organization of the C.E.R.C, which would combine civilian and military assets into one proactive force, designed from the ground up to fight what she believed was the new frontier of warfare. When she had said all there was to say, and answered every question. Wu stood outside the chambers waiting to hear their decision. She had fought harder than she had ever in her life for something this important to her. She could not imagine another word she could say that might sway them to her side. "Dr. Wu, the committee is calling you back," a Capitol police officer said. Taking a deep breath, Wu stood from her seat and re-entered the chambers, taking her place behind a long wooden desk, and waited for the chairman to say what he was going to say. "Dr. Wu," the congressman from Colorado began, "your service with the CDC has been extraordinary and upstanding that I believe I speak for all of us in this room today are blessed to have such a capable and intelligent woman serving our country." Flattery. Sigh, Wu thought. "Your proposal for the CERC is very in-depth and would appear on paper cost-effective if what you believe to be true that New York is only the first battlefield in a new era of warfare. But some of my colleagues question the need for another federal agency. What happened in New York is tragic beyond measure, but there is a question if this was a one-time event or a continuing pattern of terrorist attacks using such weapons as the VX gas against Americans." Wu breathed as she had been holding her breath the entire time. She could see more than a few eyes roll. Still, she had won over enough of them, even if they only supported her now, to save face and make it seem to the American people that action was being taken. It did not matter anyway. Wu had fought for the CERC and would have continued to fight for its creation, even if the Liberty Island attack never happened. At least now, there was a drive to see it formed. "This committee approves your request and will draft for funding the bill for the creation of the CERC, with the president expected to sign it within a month. Thank you for your time, Doctor. This panel is concluded." That was fast, Wu thought. She expected it would take up to a year for the CERC to be signed into existence. But the people were demanding action, something new that they could get behind that would make them feel a little bit safer. As Wu left the room, she felt like she could fly. She wanted to hold on to this moment for as long as she could. In the coming months and even years, she knew the CERC would be tested to its limits. She had her enemies in Washington that did not want to see her agency formed, and some of them sat on that committee. She could not fail. She would not fail. Captain Adrian Winter, New York City, New York. 6 weeks later, looking up at the sky, Adrian shielded her eyes from the glare of the sun as not a cloud was in sight. It was a beautiful day for the memorial service as thousands had come to Liberty Island to remember those lost 6 weeks ago. Isn't it supposed to rain at memorial services? Damn you, Hollywood, for your cliches. Her sister loved the rain, which was why she was not bothered by the overcast as she and her fiancé came to see the statue. It was her dream to see the monument. Adrian said she would bring her here a few years ago, but a new overseas crisis changed her plans. So, another year passed and another broken promise. How many promises did I break? I should have been a better sister. The memorial service was held so the country could mourn together, with the president and hundreds of foreign dignitaries in attendance. Adrian had buried her sister. Her body was released to the families 2 weeks after the attack, but the body was too severely damaged for an open casket. I hope you didn't have to suffer too long. Of course, she had, and Adrian knew it. She was murdered, shot multiple times, and slowly bled out, alone on the grass. You deserved so much more. More time to find your place in the world. Time to get married and have a family. I should have been there with you. I could have done something. Adrian felt survivor's guilt. It was something she had experienced before and seen from her men. She had lost plenty of people in combat, some of whom were very close friends. Every time someone was killed, she wondered if there was something she could have done differently. Every soldier knew when their time was up in war. There was nothing anyone could do to change their fate. It was part of every soldier's reality, and something each one had to come to terms with. But the guilt she felt now was worse than anything she'd experienced. Shaking her head, Adrian thought to herself, what am I, some damn 80s action hero? What could I have done that would have made a difference? I would be dead right here with you, wouldn't I, Tess? Adrian was going mad, arguing with herself that she wanted to bolt out of her seat and scream to the heavens. She wanted someone to blame. Of course, there was the terrorist, but those sons of bitches were dead. She could blame the people who made the VX gas, or those that lost it. What good would that do? The list just went on. But each time the conclusion was the same. There was nothing to direct her anger at that would have brought her sister back. Adrian focused on the stage. The Statue of Liberty was behind it, looking out over New York City, as it had for 100+ years. Then, standing up to the podium following prayers from New York's Archbishop, President Lowe began his speech. Those lives that were lost here on this horrific day are all heroes. Their names will live on in our hearts and our memories for all time. And as the country tries to heal, we must promise ourselves that their deaths were not in vain. That those responsible for this may never carry out such an attack ever again. This I vow to every American as I stand on this sacred ground. America will endure. We will not be intimidated. He prattled on for the next 15 minutes, speaking as if he was at a convention rally during an election year. He made promises that were impossible for any man, even the United States president, to keep. Of course, it was meant to fire up the American spirit of self-determination and self-reliance. It did not change the fact that over 4,000 people were dead, and likely there would be more in the future. Yes, gaps had to be purged in the system to make it harder for such groups to carry out an attack. But nothing he said was ever going to make the world the same again. Adrian rolled her eyes and thought to herself, damn turd. Tessa would hate to know you were up there speaking as if you knew her. Her death was meaningless, no matter how you try to spin it. As much as she argued about their political views, she respected her sister and her firm liberal beliefs. Worse still, President Lowe had a gift for making the sincerest words sound condescending. Most of Lowe's speech, which he rambled on for the past hour, felt like it was more about him covering his ass. He went on about how the attack was unthinkable, carried out by radical extremists who believed in anarchy. He forgot to mention the Crow movement was war veterans who pulled together for a common reason. They were determined to fight against a nation that had abandoned them when they needed help from their government. Lowe's administration had only made the problem worse. Hence, why they called for his resignation during the crisis. It did not condone what they'd done. But it was a reason, nevertheless. Tears first, patriotism second, revenge next, and the truth last, she thought bitterly. Adrian could not listen to Lowe a moment longer. She stood from her seat and quickly left. Adrian found herself racing to the spot where her sister died. The central docking area had been cleaned up and mostly restored. Some evidence of the attack retained, such as bloodstains, seeped into the concrete or stained the grass. Tears fell under Adrian's eyes as she reached the spot where her sister had died. Her body had been kept on the ground for 4 days, leaving an impression. Falling to her knees, Adrian began to dig in the dirt frantically. A voice spoke from behind Adrian. You're getting your dress uniform filthy, Captain. I don't care, Adrian said. She turned and saw who the speaker was. Her eyes widened at the realization as she quickly stood back to her feet and saluted. General Spears! At ease, Captain. The general looked past Adrian and glanced down at the hole she just dug. Adrian noticed, feeling embarrassed as she brushed the dirt off her uniform. It's a charm bracelet, sir. Excuse me? My sister, Tessa. She wore one most of her life. She added little charms to it that marked important milestones in her life. They returned it to our family, but one of the charms is missing, Adrian said. I'm sorry about your loss. I'm guessing you're tired of hearing that, aren't you, Captain? To be honest, I am, sir. Good. I think it's about time you did something about your loss than mourning, Spears said. Adrian looked confused as she said, What do you have in mind, sir? You've heard that the creation of the C.E.R.C. has been approved and signed, Spears asked. Vaguely, sir. Well, Dr. Juliet Wu will act as the director. As she builds the scientific side of things, I've been tasked with putting together the agency's military assets. I believe you would be a good fit, Captain. Me, sir? Adrian had not known the general long. She had served under his command during her last tour in Afghanistan a few years ago, and liked the man quite a bit. He was known for his quick thinking and strong determination to get the job done, but not at the risk of losing those who served under him. He was best described as a great compromiser who had a knack for making friends even out of his enemies. This quality helped him bring peace to a region of Afghanistan that had never known anything but war. I can't think of anyone better. You served me well, and I know you are cool under pressure, Spears said. I also feel, with the loss of your sister, joining to prevent such an attack as this one from ever happening again is an adequate motivation, he added. Can we prevent this from happening again? Spears put his hand on Adrian's shoulder. His eyes narrowed as his expression hardened. You damn well better believe it. Adrian paused as she looked back at the podium. The crowd was clapping quietly as President Lowe finished his speech. He took his seat as the next speaker stepped up. "You can take some time to think it over if you like," Spears said. "No," Adrian said abruptly. "The last thing I need, sir, is more time doing nothing. I'm in." Spears smiled and said, "You'll do your sister proud." Adrian saluted Spears, who was about to turn and leave but stopped himself as he looked down. "Captain," he said, indicating to the dirt with his eyes. Adrian turned and saw, lying in the dirt, a small silver charm. She recognized it right away. Falling to the ground, Adrian scooped it up and held onto the object tightly as tears rolled down her cheeks. Lieutenant Edward Lipton, somewhere in the South China Sea, October 3rd, now. Lieutenant Edward Lipton, U.S. Navy, moved swiftly through the nuclear submarine's narrow corridors. His destination was further stern in the operations room, where 3 Navy SEALs under his command had gathered for their briefing. Tripping over one of the lower bulkheads, Lipton cursed under his breath. Even with the 9 years in the Navy, he still hated submarines. The notion of being inside a metal tube 2,000 feet underwater was unsettling, as even the slightest pinprick to the hull could be disastrous. The thought of freezing waters rushing into a fissure, filling the interior of the boat with little to no chance of escape, terrified him to no end. Nevertheless, submarines and SEALs went hand in hand. Reaching the operations room, his team squeezed into the small space, accompanied by one of Utah's officers. Everyone stood around a digital display that sat in the center of the room. The screen was currently settled on a small island in the South China Sea, about 150 miles northeast of the Philippines. China had long waited to control these waters. First, they spent billions of dollars building artificial islands, Chinese land in the middle of a free sail zone. Then, ignoring international maritime law, they set their boundaries for what was claimed as Chinese waters. Finally, any foreign ship entering the territory violated their sovereignty, leaving the 2 great military powers on a razor's edge in this region. "I just got off the box with Washington. The mission is a go," Lipton said. A naval officer removed a key that hung around his neck. Once Lipton confirmed the go-ahead, stepping over to a locked box, he inserted the key and unlocked the safe. Inside was an envelope that was sealed. Taking it out, the officer stepped over to Lipton and handed it over. "Confirm the transfer of sealed orders at 1808 Zulu time," the officer said. "Confirmed," Lipton replied. Lipton opened the envelope. A small disc was inside, which he slid into the console. A moment later, an image of their target was displayed. Lipton had already been briefed before his team rendezvoused with Utah, but that only covered the operation's essential aspects. Finite details would be planned and sent ahead to the USS Utah before being uploaded onto a disk and sealed away until this moment. The digital map automatically shifted before settling on a small island just over 80 nautical miles from the submarine's current position. Then, it zoomed in closer before centering on a small landmass, only about a mile in length and a few hundred yards across. A single dock was built to the island's west, large enough to receive a Chinese-type 052D destroyer on a supply run. A series of 2 small buildings were situated in the island's center with connecting roads to the dock, joined by a barracks that housed 300 Chinese Marines. More than a few weapon placements were seen: HQ-9 surface-to-air missile and a few anti-ship weapon systems. The last structure was a radar building, standing on the far north of the island. While well hidden, there were indications the buildings had other purposes, as a massive power grid and external refrigeration units could be seen, which would not serve any of the soldiers' immediate needs. Indeed, much larger and more critical islands in the area would have easily overlooked this installation. Intelligence has confirmed that this island, codenamed Manta, is a secret Chinese viral weapon research facility. It houses some of the worst stuff imaginable, all of which can easily be put on any number of warheads and fired at targets upward of 500 miles. A particular bad germ, known as the Pangu Virus, has our boys back in Washington worried, Lipton said. Lipton began cycling through the files, each revealing high-resolution images of Manta. He focused on the main facility where they believed the virus was being kept. The most significant pictures were a series of blueprints that had somehow been hacked from a Chinese server or smuggled out from a record room in some highly secure government building back on the mainland. The facility seemed simple enough, with various corridors and officers surrounding a central chamber, serving as the research floor. "We know that 6 years ago, the Chinese military used an earlier version of the virus on their people when a small village in the Kaizian district was exposed by a weaponized version of the Pangu Virus. The death toll was 100%, with some 1,500 people dead in as little as a week. If this weapon were ever to be used against a civilian population, such as Manila, the closest high-value target in the range of Manta, it would make the Liberty Island attack seem like a chickenpox outbreak. We're destroying it then? Asked Chief Lewis. As much as I would like to say yes to that question, we've been instructed to capture several samples of the virus and bring it back home. The rest is to be destroyed using thermite charges, Lipton replied. This should be interesting, Lewis added. Thankfully, we won't be doing all the legwork ourselves, Lipton stated. The map shifted to the north of the island as a new set of images were shown, detailing a raiding party of 6 vessels to head for the island and strike various points along the northern coast. A group of Vietnamese pirates has been commissioned and kindly asked to provoke the Marines stationed in Manta, so we can enter, get our sample, and extract swiftly. Hopefully without too much of a headache, Lipton said. Those poor bastards won't last long against the Marines, Petty Officer Carmen said. I doubt they'll last 10 minutes. Thankfully, that's all we need. Once the virus has been grabbed and data destroyed, we extract back to the water. We will meet with a disguised cargo ship, the Voyager Dawn, where the sample can safely be stored, Lipton said. With the world's most dangerous viral weapon? Man, I miss the old days when all we were worried about was nuclear annihilation, Lewis added. Everyone chuckled, but the unease in their voices was evident. Each man knew the rules of war had changed since the fall of the Soviet Union. Viral and chemical agents had become the new weapons of mass destruction. Over the past 30 years, dozens of cities worldwide were test beds for terrorists who managed to get their hands on whatever could be dug out of the old Soviet stockpiles. However, Liberty Island had been the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back. Since the attack, the U.S. has been on edge, seeking out any potential threat at home and abroad and neutralizing it. More important was the desire to regain the lead in this war by making or stealing whatever horrible and unthinkable viral weapons other countries might have discovered. Question, sir, Carmen spoke. Why not just head back to Utah? Good point. There's fear that the Utah might be tracked and tied the good old USA to the raid. So, it'll drop us off well outside the range of the island and continue its merry way. The Voyager Dawn will be passing in the opposite direction and should go unnoticed as the ship makes routine trips in this neck of the woods. Understood, sir. Can't say I like it, Carmen said. Well, once this is done, we can rest assured this nightmare will never get out and take more lives. Once Uncle Sam has it locked away, never to see the light of day again, Lipton said. He doubted his own words. He tried to hide his mistrust as well as he could. As the old saying went, it was not for him to ask why, but to do and die. Still, he wished, looking into the faces of his team, he could ease their fears. There were too many variables to consider, as handing a weaponized virus was well outside his comfort zone. Rules of engagement, sir, Chief Saw said. I was just about to get to that. We are expected to reach the island at 0300, so the lab should be minimally staffed. Nevertheless, we can't afford witnesses. So, if it moves, you drop them. Hopefully, once the island goes on lockdown, most non-combatants will be secured elsewhere and out of our way, Lipton answered. Non-combatants, Lewis chuckled. These bastards deserve to die for what they've made. It isn't like we're saintly, Shaw said. Nevertheless, we want to avoid engaging the enemy at all cost. We can't afford to be caught with our pants down on this one, or none of us go home. Lipton quickly shot back. Everyone studied the images, playing in their mind how everything was expected to go, but knowing all too well that anything was possible. Every SEAL worried about the unknown, and how quickly a mission could go south. Make sure everyone goes over the mission packet. Memorize every detail before you get some rest. Let's make sure we pull this one off without a hitch and get home to our families in one piece, Lipton said. Each man nodded their agreement. Copies of the report were handed to each team member as they broke off to catch some shut-eye. Alarms wailed continuously as Lipton and his team ducked behind an outcrop of concrete wave breakers, watching tracer rounds and rocket-propelled grenades streak through the sky. As Lipton had hoped, the pirates had come through, hitting the island with everything their tiny but agile boats had on board. The Marines guarding the installation acted quickly, rushing from their barracks and crewed their stations. Come on! We don't have much time before those fuckers bug out, Lipton said. The SEALs quickly moved out from their cover. Lipton didn't waste any time once he reached the rear entrance. Taking up a defensive position, He waited as Chief Lewis placed a C4 charge on the door, blowing it off its hinges. Swiftly, Lipton led his people through the building as they headed down a long hallway. The team reached the central lab a short time later, the door automatically sliding open, allowing Lipton and his team to enter without the need to force the door. I kind of expected things to be a little more, well, impressive, Chief Shaw said. I hate to agree with you, but me too, Lipton said. The truth was, the lab didn't seem all that important. Everything was decades old, and would have felt at home in an average high school science lab back home. Lewis, begin setting charges. The rest of you, with me, Lipton ordered. He moved carefully to another adjacent wing of the lab, this time coming to a series of locked doors, which he blew open with ease. Pay dirt, he said. A cold storage locker could be seen to the east of the lab, which Lipton indicated for Shaw to head to, while he and Carmen set C4 charges around the area, while breaking the caps of several tanks of oxygen, propane, and anything else that was flammable. Lewis, Lipton asked. I found it, sir, Lewis called back. Lipton joined his man in the cold storage, where thousands of vials were kept refrigerated. Each one was written in Chinese, as to be expected. Thanks to a handy scanner that Lewis held, a digital readout translated what he saw in English. Box it and blow the rest, Lipton said. You know, we would be doing the world a favor if we just set everything on fire. I'm inclined to agree, but orders are orders, Lipton said. Lewis grabbed a handful of capsules and dropped them into a specially made container that would keep them cold and safe until the team reached the Voyager Dawn. Once he was done, he and Lipton set double the amount of thermite charges in the storage room to ensure that everything was destroyed in the blast. The last thing they wanted was for the soldiers on the base to be contaminated. Are we set? Lipton called out. Charges are set, Carmen replied. Loading a bug onto their servers now, Shaw replied. And the package is secure, Lewis answered. Then, let's get the hell out of... Just then, a technician walked into the room despite that the alarm had not ended. He froze in place, only his eyes seen as he wore a lab coat and surgical mask and cap. The man froze like a rabbit under the butcher's knife when he saw the black-clad, armed men standing before him. Lipton fired a quick burst, putting 3 bullets in his chest. The man fell face first, landing against a workbench, knocking all the contents to the floor. When some chemicals mixed, a fire suddenly sparked to life, consuming the dead man. Let's move, people, Lipton said. As the fire alarm sounded in the lab, a few soldiers appeared down the hall, coming out from one of the doors leading to the lower levels where most scientists were kept. The SEALs dropped the soldiers quickly, running past their bodies as they bolted back the way they'd come. Once outside, they could hear screaming from inside the building as more soldiers arrived, finding the dead. Lipton and his people never broke stride as they ran as quickly as possible, reaching where they left their Zodiac. Inside! Let's cast off! Lipton said. Chinese soldiers were outside now, rushing to gather more men, but were unaware of where Lipton and his team had disappeared. By the time anyone would get to their position, they were gone, speeding off over the horizon just seconds before the lab and everything inside it blew. The sky flashed bright white, with the sound of the explosion reaching Lipton a mile out to sea. Smiles were on everyone's faces as they began to laugh. As the thrill of what they'd just done sunk in, they remained on course for the next 2 hours, adrift out in the middle of nowhere before the 50-year-old freighter, the Voyager Dawn, appeared over the horizon. Lipton could see through his night vision. The ship made a slight course correction before heading straight for them. Once the Voyager Dawn came alongside their small craft, a ladder was dropped for the SEALs. Lewis went up first, holding tightly onto the case that had the Pangu samples inside, and was soon followed by the rest of the team. Lipton was last as he set a small demo charge on his boat, which would destroy it, removing any evidence they'd ever been out there in the first place. Once on board, the team went below deck to the cargo bay, where a cold storage chamber was stored. Hard to imagine that such a small thing could cause so much harm, Lewis said as he took out the samples, 8 vials total, and placed them carefully into their new containers. Hardly seems worth it if you ask me, he added. Where's the honor in defeating an enemy with something no one can hope to fight against? I don't know, Chief. I don't even know why God would allow such a horrible thing to exist in the first place, Lipton said. Well, I, for one, want to forget this day ever happened, Lewis said. Same here. 2 days later, Lipton felt sick to his stomach. He had already thrown up twice in the past hour as the Voyager Dawn rocked violently in rough seas. He was told 2 hours ago that a massive storm had surged right across the path of the ship, and while the captain had requested to change course, it had been rejected. Washington wanted the Voyager Dawn back in American waters as soon as possible, as the fallout from the Chinese base attack had made international news. China claimed the West attacked its sovereign territory. Typically, such actions would have been swept under the rug as an embarrassment that either China or the United States wouldn't allow such an incident to go noticed by the world at large. But something was different this time. It was as if Beijing wanted the world to know something terrible had happened, almost as if they were trying to deflect blame for something that had not happened yet. Suddenly, an alarm sounded right before the ship captain screamed over the loudspeaker. "Brace for impact!" Lipton hadn't time to heed the warning as the ship was struck. He fell against the bulkhead, slamming hard against his left shoulder, feeling it pop. He forced himself back to his feet as the Voyager Dawn continued to rock severely. So much so that for a second, he thought he was standing on the walls. Racing upstairs, his hand holding his shoulder, Lipton reached the bridge. 2 windows had been blown out, allowing a wash of freezing water to flood the compartment. "Christ's sake!" Lipton said, his eyes budging as he witnessed the fury of the storm outside. "How far are we from the mainland?" he asked. "Hours? At least 11. To be honest, I don't think this bucket is going to make it. I haven't seen seas like this in ages," the captain said. "It is like Poseidon has a personal grudge against you boys," he added. "Radio the Coast Guard," Lipton said. He had to raise his voice. Barely a word could be heard as the storm overpowered everything. "I can't! The radio is gone," the captain said. "What? Are you serious?" "I'm not a man that lies, Lieutenant." "Captain, look!" One of the bridge crew screamed as he pointed, indicating to a massive wave bearing down on them. "Hard to port!" The crew heeded the command as the helmsman pulled the wheel as far to port as it would allow. The Voyager Dawn had to come head-on with the rogue wave and try to power through it. The wave was coming quickly, striking the bow. At a slight angle, everyone on the ship's bridge was thrown from their feet and crashed hard against the back wall. A gulf of water flooded onto the bridge, shattering every window as it rolled over the crew, carrying 2 men outside where they disappeared into the darkness. Lipton felt like he was drowning as he swallowed a mouthful of seawater. "Lieutenant, are you all right, boy?" the captain asked as he lifted Lipton back to his feet. "Get this boat back to dry land ASAP! I need to check on the cargo!" Lipton shouted. 2 of his men were already down there, Lewis and Shaw. He ordered them to stay with the sample before the storm hit. Right now, they were struggling to move some debris that had crashed down on someone, pinning them to the floor. "Who is it?" Lipton asked, joining his men. "Carmen!" Shaw yelled. "We need some equipment to get him out," Lewis said. Lipton could see it was pointless. While he couldn't see his man, save for a single leg, he knew Carmen was more than likely crushed and died instantly under so much weight. "The virus. We need to make sure it is secure," Lipton ordered. "But Carmen," Shaw said. "He's gone. We'll come back for him when we can. But right now, we have to secure our mission." Lipton's words sounded harsh, he knew, but they needed to be told to snap his people back. The remaining 3 SEALs rushed over to the container that housed the samples, finding that it was at risk of being broken from its secure place within the cargo hold, despite being bolted to the floor. Lipton stumbled forward as the ship rocked violently. His vision was starting to blur as the pain in his shoulder was becoming more than he could bear. Snapping himself back, he quickly inputted the code into the locking mechanism, opening the swinging doors. "Pull it open! Quickly!" he demanded. Lewis and Shaw did as they were ordered. Lipton rushed inside and stopped just before the sealed containment device the samples had been stored in. It lay on the ground and was pretty bashed up, with a part of the case ajar. Lipton put in the next series of codes as he steadied himself, forcing the case open as he saw each of the vials were safely inside their cold storage. "I need the backup case quickly. This one has been compromised," Lipton said. Shaw ran forward and grabbed it. "I got it," he said, turning to hand it to Lipton. Right then, the collision alarm sounded once more, followed shortly by the boat captain yelling, "Rogue wave!" Lipton tried to steady himself, wanting to slam shut the case he still held in his hands before the wave could hit the Voyager Dawn. It was too late. The ship was slammed harder than it had been before as the 3 SEALs were thrown about the cargo bay like toys. At that moment, Lipton could have sworn that time suddenly slowed to a crawl as he watched the vials fly free from his grasp. Each one soared through the air before crashing on the hard steel floor of the cargo bay, shattering into a spray of glass shards. He knew the virus was invisible to the eye, with only the liquid splashing onto the ground. Yet, he swore at that moment he could see the face of death wash over him. "If there is a God, please let us sink to the bottom of the ocean." Chelsea Trader, Half Moon Bay, California. Chelsea smiled as she waited patiently for her grandmother to pour the tea. It took a lot of effort. More now than it had this same time last year. She was slowly starting to slip away. Her body, at least, as the 94-year-old's mind was as sharp as a bag of razors. Oh dear, I am so sorry. That is far too much for a little thing like you to have to drink, Bella said. She accidentally overpoured Chelsea's teacup. Fine china with a pink cherry blossom pattern, something she only brought out for her great-granddaughter during her visits. It's quite all right. You know I'm more than happy to drink my fill, Granny Belle, Chelsea said. Nonsense. A lady is served the right amount, and not a drop more, or a drop less, Bella said. Oh, Granny. Chelsea observed her grandmother wipe the tiny saucer of the excess tea she spilled. Everything in her life was proper, perhaps having more to do with her English upbringing than anything else. Chelsea also knew it had a lot to do with holding on to a time that felt simpler for her. Something she had some measure of control over, given how her age has advanced on the formerly pioneering woman. During the war, even during the worst of it, as the bombs fell around us, I can remember my mother serving my sister and me tea. She had a very particular way about her that I've tried to emulate for as long as I've drawn breath. Yet, I have never quite mastered the art as well as she, Bella said. You've done fine if you ask me, Chelsea replied. Aren't you sweet? How you managed to be so different than your father, I will never know. Chelsea sighed at the thought. I did my best, you know. I lost my daughter, as your father lost a mother. It was a lot of work for me to drop my life and take in a grandchild to raise as my own. Perhaps if I had a man in my life, things might have been different. Sometimes I suppose the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, Bella said. She finished cleaning the saucer before dropping a single sugar cube into her and Chelsea's cups. Stirring, the pure gold spoon's clanking was soothing as Chelsea's mouth began to water with anticipation. Cream, dear? She asked. Of course, Granny. Don't I always want cream? It is polite to ask, nonetheless. Even as her hands shook terribly, Bella held the creamer as steady as she could. 2 drops dripped into Chelsea's cup before moving on to her own and adding 3. The black tea turned ghostly white as the cream rose to the surface. Chelsea picked up her saucer and cup as her granny had taught, holding the cup properly between her index finger and thumb. She took a small sip and smiled. This is wonderful, Granny, as always, Chelsea said. This is wonderful, Granny, as always, Chelsea said. Both women stared at one another for a minute, not saying another word as they both enjoyed the hot beverage before carefully setting the teacup and saucer back onto the table. And how is that big lug of a father of yours these days? I do not think I've seen him going on 2.5 years now, even though we are only a short train ride apart, Bella asked. Chelsea sighed again. She did not like to talk about her father all that much. She wished the man would give more time to come and visit the woman who raised him following his mother and father's tragic death in an automobile crash 40 years ago. He's busy, as usual, Chelsea replied. Still managing that empire of his? Bella asked. A crumbling one, Chelsea replied. The new state laws are making it more difficult for him to acquire a property. When he does, the amount of taxes he has to pay is quite a lot. He's barely keeping his head above water, she added. So is the fate of a pirate, Bella said, her voice showing more than a hint of sarcasm. He's not a pirate, Granny, Chelsea chuckled. He and that wife of his take people's homes and resell them for profit. If that isn't a pirate, then I don't know what a pirate is. Well, maybe. He certainly does not have a peg leg and a talking bird on his shoulder. He does own a huge boat, though, Chelsea said. Both women laughed as they sipped more tea. And you, my dear, how's work? Bella asked. Difficult. I know I went to school for this, but it is much harder than I ever thought, Chelsea said. Oh? Chelsea corrected herself. I don't mean hard like I can't do it. I mean, it is difficult to be around people that I can't always help. I understand. Nevertheless, what you're doing is very important. At least you can bring comfort to those that won't get better. That is very important. Perhaps more so than you know. Thank you, Granny. I just wish Dad and Mom saw it that way. I don't think either of them has forgiven me for dropping out of Stanford, Chelsea said. You did what you felt was right. Besides, there's always a time to go back to school. Look at me. I did not receive my master's degree until I was in my 60s. Bella said. I know, but things are a little different now, Granny. There are more expectations today than there were in your day, Chelsea said. Oh, nonsense. Women have always had expectations placed on their shoulders far more than most men do. You'll do fine. And even if your mother and father can't get their heads out of their collective asses and see how you've grown into a strong and caring woman, I at least can. I'm proud of you, Chelsea. A tear came to Chelsea's eyes as her granny rested her hand on hers. Thank you. That means a lot to me, Chelsea said. The ringing of a bell tolled, interrupting the peaceful quiet between the two women. Oh, marvelous. It is bingo time, Bella said, beaming. What do you say we go teach these old fuddy-duddies a thing or two? Bella asked. I would love to, Chelsea replied. Chelsea spent the next couple of hours at her granny's retirement community playing bingo. Before dinner, they took a walk on the beach. Chelsea adored these moments with her granny, knowing that each time she spent with her was one fewer she had left. She always related to the older woman more than her parents. She hated to admit it, but it was the truth. I think you're right, Granny. I need to move out of their house and find an apartment, even if I can't afford to right now. Better to live in a cardboard box than stay another year, Chelsea said. That would be wise, Bella agreed. You are much stronger than either me or your parents, my dear. I've always known that. You'll land on your feet, she added. Gripping her granny's hand, they were silent as both watched the sun go down. Off in the distance, thick storm clouds were blowing towards the coast, as flashes of lightning could just barely be made out as the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon. Chelsea woke to a drizzle of rain beating against the window. She was laying on the floor, wrapped in a heavy quilt, and two soft pillows under her head. Behind her, lying asleep in her bed, was her great-grandmother, blissfully deep in her dreams, most likely remembering a time long past. Chelsea rose, quietly picked up her bed, and folded everything into a neat pile before putting it into a tall antique dresser cabinet. In another month, she would return, pull them out, and sleep next to her granny as she had always done since she was a little girl. For now, life was calling her back. With a deep sigh, she knew she had to make some difficult choices in the next few days. 30 minutes later, Chelsea was outside the retirement village. She wore a jogging suit and a hoodie. The air was nippy, with a wet taste to it. The storm that had been out to sea had brushed over the west coast shortly after she and her granny returned to the community to enjoy the rest of their night watching old black and white movies. Right now, there was still some rain lazily falling. Checking her watch, she saw she had 3 hours until the first train back to the city departed the station. There was just enough time to jog a couple of miles down the beach, return for her things, say goodbye to Granny, and get back to San Francisco just before her shift at the hospital. She put a pair of wireless earbuds on and tuning in to her favorite Johnny Cash album. Then, she took off at a slow jog down the winding path that led to the beach. Chelsea enjoyed the softness of the sand. Her feet dug into the smooth surface that felt as if the whole beach had been freshly paved over. She must have run this same path 100 times over the years and enjoyed every moment. At this early hour, the sun has not risen. However, the community was peaceful and typically woke later in the morning. So, Chelsea had the whole beach to herself. About 45 minutes into her jog, just as the song Ring of Fire started to play, a strange sound forced Chelsea to stop and pull her earbuds out to listen more carefully. It sounded again, a peculiar grinding of metal as waves bashed against it. She could not see what it was, not yet. She hadn't rounded the cliff that blocked her view. The grinding that sounded like a beached metal monster continued as Chelsea steadied her pace and continued along the beach. Some more objects were on shore. To her surprise, most of it was clothes. This wasn't unusual necessarily, as cargo ships often lost whole crate loads of goods that eventually washed up on a beach somewhere in the world. Finally, as she went around the outcrops of rocks that jutted from the cliff, she saw it. A container ship had run aground. The bow of the ship was jammed between an outcrop of rocks. More containers were washed up, all along the vessel with piles of clothes and other effects. Soaking wet, coming and leaving with the ebb and flow of the tide. My word! Chelsea said. She quickly took her cell phone out of her pocket and dialed 911. It rang twice before an operator answered. 911, what's your emergency? Hello, my name is Chelsea Trader. I'm not sure how to describe this, but I was jogging on the beach and I came across a big cargo ship. Unfortunately, there does not seem to be anyone that I can see. As far as I know, I might be the first person on the scene. But anyway, I think you'd better send someone and check this out in case someone on board is hurt. Excuse me? But did you say a ship? The operator asked. Yes, a huge one. It says on the front... Chelsea strained her eyes as she tried to get a good look at the lettering on the ship's bow in the low light. The Voyager Dawn? Okay, thank you. We'll have a patrol car there as soon as possible. Please, miss. Traitor, remain where you are to give a statement when the officer arrives. And I would advise you stay away from the ship in the meantime. Okay, thank you. Hello? Is anyone there? She shouted. There was no reply, even though her voice carried well. She continued moving forward, using the flashlight on her phone's back to see better as she crossed over the rocks along the shoreline's edge. Hello? She called out again. I called the police. They should be here shortly to help if anyone needs assistance. There still was no reply. She thought it was strange that there were no signs of a crew. Her high school boyfriend had become a mariner, so she knew that a ship this size should at least have a crew of 20. It was then, in what little dim light she could see by, that she saw what looked like a man crawling along the beach, away from the wreckage of the Voyager Dawn. Hey! Stay there! I'm on my way! Chelsea cried out as loud as she could. She carefully moved down through the rocks and back onto the sandy beach, running as quickly as her legs could take her to the man. Hey! Are you okay? Chelsea dropped to her knees right beside the man. Grabbing him, she carefully rolled him over. She saw he was wearing a Navy uniform. The man's eyes were wide and blood red. She realized that blood was coming out of his sockets, nose, ears, and mouth. I'm a nurse. I'm here to help, Chelsea said. The man struggled to say something, even trying to push her away from him as he gasped for words. Hey, relax. I'm trying to help you. Just as she finished her words, she heard sirens coming down the road above the beach. Some words now escaped the man's voice as he repeated the same thing over and over. Pangu. Pangu. Released. Pangu. Wait. What are you trying to say? Chelsea asked. She leaned closer to him, feeling helpless despite her training. She simply did not know what to do for the man, not without proper equipment. Released, the man said with incredible effort. What? No, I cannot. I won't let you go. I have to get you some help, Chelsea said, believing the man wanted her to release him. Flashing lights from a police cruiser could be seen as it parked on a cliffside. Hello? I need help! There's a man down here and he needs medical attention! Chelsea shouted as loud as she could. She screamed again just as a flashlight from above was cast down at her. Hey! This man needs medical attention! Call an ambulance! Chelsea said. You're going to be all right, Chelsea said, looking down at the man in her arms. An hour later, Chelsea watched as the sailor she had found was zipped tightly into a black bag. He died 5 minutes after the first officer had arrived on the scene. She felt guilty for having somehow failed the man. If only she knew what was wrong with him and the extent of his injuries. She thought she might have been able to help him better. Chelsea hardly heard the officer standing before her, with a blanket wrapped around her as he asked his last question. Excuse me? She replied. Was he the only crew member of the ship you had contact with? The officer asked. Yes, just him. Is it all right if I get a ride back to my grandmother's place? I would like to take a shower. I need to get back to the city in a few hours. I'm sure that can be arranged, Miss Trader. If we have any further questions for you, we know how to reach you. The officer replied. Sure, of course. Sure, of course. I think it might have brought him comfort in those final moments. I know it would have me if I were in his place. Chelsea nodded as she rubbed her hands, failing to get the dried blood from the man off her fingers. Dr. Juliet Wu, Bethesda, Maryland. The ride up to the 9th floor of the Bethesda Naval Hospital was agonizing. For years, Juliet Wu had come here to watch her father die as he received cancer treatment. An old soldier, he was a man of incredible courage and dignity, but it hit Wu hard to see such a character brought to his knees as he slowly rotted away to nothing. He battled his disease for 5 years, as if it were an enemy that needed to be quashed. For Wu, it broke her. Her father had been her rock. She was determined to fight his cancer and even went as far as to promise him a cure. After all, she was the brilliant Dr. Wu, lead researcher at the CDC. However, it was not enough, as his will was broken and his heart was ready to move on. For a long time after, she had resented him, angry he had given up so suddenly. But then something far worse happened to Wu. 2 years ago, which was supposed to be the most crucial time in her life. As she built the C.E.R.C. from the ground up, the worst tragedy any woman could face hit home. May, her daughter, became gravely ill with a disease that had no name among the scientific community until a few months ago. The bright young girl who showed incredible promise collapsed one day and did not wake back up for 6 months. Something in her brain had been infected, resistant to all antibiotics. Evasive surgery followed and slowed the abnormal growth, yet it kept coming back like a persistent bug. Wu had always admired the virus and how resilient they were. A virus could survive extreme cold, heat, and levels of radiation that would doom a person. Yet it was a deviously simple life form capable of wreaking so much havoc, even bringing a world to its knees. The elevator opened. Wu took a deep breath before finding the courage to step forward, feeling like the threshold was an unbroken force field that wanted to hold her back. Each time, it mentally and physically pained her to find the necessary strength to take this long walk. Inside, her daughter's room was filled with balloons, flowers, toys, and cards sent to her by family and friends over the past week since she had celebrated her 9th birthday. May was asleep as Wu entered. Right away, tears dropped from the corner of her eyes when seeing her daughter in such a sorry state. She seemed thinner and weaker each day, with her long hair almost entirely gone, and with only a few strands dangling like loose threads from a wicker doll. The bags under her eyes were nearly dark as night, as her eyes sunk deep into the sockets. Her arms were nothing but bone, as her muscles had been chewed away by the disease. Yet underneath this frail creature was a beautiful girl, whose heart beat with the determination to survive. Wu took her daughter's hand and held onto it for a long while as she lovingly stared down at her sleeping child. Subconsciously, May gripped her hand with what little strength she could manage. "Julia, I was hoping I might catch you today," Dr. Carter said as he entered the room. "John, it's good to see you," Wu replied, not turning to face her friend. "She's been asleep for a while. I think she had a good day. She was up for a little while and even managed to walk down to the nurse's station. The ladies love her. I believe they even let her answer a few phone calls," Dr. Carter said. "But still no improvements?" Wu asked. Carter sighed and he handed May's chart to Wu. "Sadly, no. Her condition is progressive and aggressively getting worse. I don't think she'll be able to maintain her motor skills much longer, as the disease is spreading deeper into the brain." "It's quite impressive, isn't it, John? This thing in my daughter's skull," Wu said. She looked over the charts reading the latest CT scan of her brain. "I don't know if I would view it that way, with all due respect," Carter replied. "The May syndrome, we've agreed to call it. My own patient zero right here in my arms, and there isn't a damn thing I can do to make it better. I think, John, sometimes this is nature paying me back for killing so many of her creations over the years," Wu said. "You've saved a lot of lives, Julia, and you're going to save a lot more," Carter said. "But not my May." Wu rubbed her daughter's forehead as she cried, but was too embarrassed to turn and let another see her weakness. "She still has some time. There are treatments we've not tried yet. We need her to get a little stronger, and we can move her on to the next stage of trials," Carter said sympathetically.
"Mama?"
May said in a soft voice as she opened her eyes. "I'll leave you two alone. If there's anything you need, I will be close by," Carter said before he turned and left the room. "I'm right here, baby. I heard you had a fun day," Wu said.
"I did. I got to be a nurse. But then I got tired and wanted to go to sleep."
May said. "Did you have good dreams?"
"Yes. I dreamed of Daddy and you in the park we used to play in."
May said warmly. "Those were good days," Wu said.
"Daddy came by yesterday. We played the whole day, did you know?"
"I did. That is wonderful, honey."
"He said you haven't talked to him for a long time. You should call him. I think he's very sad."
May said. "We both are very sad. But I don't think we can talk, honey," Wu said. There was a melancholy hint of bitterness in her tone. May's father had walked out 3 years ago, not too long before May's illness took hold.
"Daddy still loves you, Mama."
"I know he does. And I love him too," Wu replied. She told the truth. She would always love Mark. But they had drifted apart. With her dead set on creating the C.E.R.C, trying for years to get it pushed through, their lives had taken 2 vastly different paths. She did not blame him, however. He was a good provider and a wonderful father. He just expected the same level of affection in return. which Wu could not reciprocate. May looked around her room, staring at all the things that had been given to her. Her smile faded, however, as she turned back to her mother.
Mama, will I see my next birthday?
Wu could not stop herself from breaking down as fresh tears fell from her eyes, which only served to make May cry as well. This is not fair. You should not be worrying about these things. Not now. Not when you have so much life still in you. Wu thought as she grabbed a hold of May and held on to her. Of course you will. Mommy works every day to ensure we kill that nasty bug in your head. I will not let anything bad happen to you. You believe Mommy, right?
Of course I do. I was just wondering.
May said. And next year, you will get even more things to play with, Wu said, wiping away her tears.
That's okay. I'm happy with what I have.
May yawned, as it was evident she was exhausted. You need to get some rest, Wu said.
I will. Are you coming back tomorrow?
May asked. I will try. Mommy has a lot of work to do. She has to help make you better.
Oh yeah! That would be great!
Go back to sleep, dear. Wu stood to her feet and pulled out her cell phone, which had been buzzing nonstop for the past 10 minutes. She ignored it, even though she knew it must have been imperative. But her people knew what she was supposed to be doing today, and were under instructions not to bother her, which they typically respected. What is it? Wu asked as she returned the call. Dr. Wu, there's been a serious incident in California, Half Moon Bay to be exact. We believe it might be the Pangu Virus, the woman on the other end of the call said. Are you certain? Wu asked. We are. Your briefing will be waiting for you once you are in the air. I took the liberty of readying a jet, which is fueled and waiting for your arrival at Andrews Air Force Base. Good. I'm on my way now. Wu was gone, hurrying back down the hall. Leaving was the worried mother who'd come to see her dying daughter. Replaced was the hardened woman used to a crisis. A woman ready and eager to prove to everyone what the C.E.R.C. was capable of. Chelsea Trader, San Francisco, California. Chelsea stepped off the bus that dropped her off right in front of the Treasure Island Veterans Hospital where she worked. It was raining hard, with a bitter nip in the air, yet she felt hot to the point she was sweating. She figured it had more to do with what she experienced earlier in the day than any sort of bug that she might have picked up. After reporting to the police, she could return to her grandmother's retirement home and get the rest of her things, but not before taking a long, hot shower. Then, with a kiss and a hug goodbye, Chelsea was off, catching the train an hour later and back in San Francisco shortly after. While home for a brief while, she thought about calling in sick. A part of her just wanted to go to sleep and pretend everything that happened today was just some kind of terrible dream. But the second she walked through the front door, her father was already on her case for some nonsense she couldn't remember doing. So, she dressed, slipped into her uniform, and caught the bus, determining it was better to bury her feelings and put all her energy into her patients. At least she could help, unlike that poor man on the beach. I wonder what's going on, said Patty, one of Chelsea's co-workers. On her break, she was sitting on one of the benches outside the hospital smoking a cigarette. Turning back, Chelsea saw a dozen police cars speeding along the Oakland Bay Bridge. I don't know. Maybe there's an accident, Chelsea replied. Hey, I thought you were quitting, she asked, looking back toward Patty. Patty smiled as she rubbed the butt of her cigarette in the ashtray. That was my last one, Patty said. I hope so. Those things will kill you, Chelsea said. A lot of things, dear, can kill me. Might as well enjoy a vice here and there, Patty commented. I would try chocolate. The only thing it will kill is your waistline, Chelsea joked. Honey, that isn't a problem for you. Me, on the other hand. Patty paused and looked closely at Chelsea. Are you okay? You look a little flushed, she asked. Oh, I'm fine. Just a little too much exertion in the morning, Chelsea replied. Right. Exertion, Patty smiled. What's his name? She asked. Oh, stop. I'll see you inside, Chelsea said. Okay, hon. I'll be up shortly. The hospital was a bit busier than usual, which was expected given it was cold and flu season. However, Chelsea felt a bit odd as she walked through the lobby. Her senses seemed heightened as every sound, whisper, and beeping of instruments in the patient's room made her feel jumpy. Chelsea hurried her pace, wanting to get away from the crowd as quickly as possible. She decided to skip the cafeteria, where she would typically grab a cup of coffee before heading upstairs to begin her shift. Once she was alone in the elevator, she began to feel a bit more at ease as her mind cleared and the temperature dropped. Exiting the elevator, she only had to walk a few feet to reach her station. The nursing staff was all looking up at the TV, which was tuned to the local news. Hey, Chelsea! Have you heard about what's happening in Half Moon Bay? Steve said as Chelsea put her bag under her desk before signing in. Your grandmother lives there, right? He asked. Yeah, and no, I haven't heard about what is happening there. So why am I lying about this? She thought to herself. It's pretty insane. The feds rolled in and closed the whole town down. They're reporting the C.E.R.C, or whatever those new guys are called, are afraid there's some sort of environmental hazard. God, I hope this isn't another Liberty Island. Are they saying anything else? Chelsea asked, wondering if there had been any mention of the cargo ship. No, they're being pretty tight-lipped about what's going on. Certainly it isn't helping us, though. We have twice as many patients as usual, thinking every sneeze is another attack or something. Steve said. I'm sure it is nothing and will blow over by tomorrow, Chelsea said. I hope so. Well, you have a full house today. Your patient list is called up. As for myself, I have a hot date tonight. I'll catch you tomorrow, Steve said as he grabbed his backpack and coat. Thanks, Steve. I'll see you tomorrow, Chelsea replied. Chelsea printed out her patient list before starting her rounds. It did not take too long before her typical routine set in, and her mind focused solely on the people she was charged with caring for. Hours later, Chelsea was making her second rounds of the day, going to each of her patients' rooms to take readings, jot down their vitals, and generally have a conversation with them. It always saddened her that many of her patients were alone with no family to speak of. Most were old veterans from previous branches of the military or families of vets. Most were generally forgotten now that their service was over. But many still suffering from ailments from long-forgotten wars relegated to history books. How's it going, Mr. Marshall? Did you sleep well? Chelsea said as she walked into her last check-in. Much better now that you're here, my dear, he replied. Aren't you the sweetest? Chelsea said as she wrote down Mr. Marshall's blood pressure and heart rate into her pad. Not as sweet as you. You know, of all the nurses that take care of this old sailor, you've got to be my favorite. Oh? That isn't what Nurse Jackie said to me. She thinks she's your favorite, Chelsea said. Mr. Marshall blushed, which brought a smile to Chelsea's face. Well, you can't fault an old scuttlebutt for admiring pretty girls, can you? I bet you had plenty of pretty girls in your day, Mr. Marshall, Chelsea said. Oh, I had eyes for only one girl since I was in high school. One girl? Oh, really? Yes. My blessing. My angel. The love of my life since before I knew the meaning of the word. I do hope the story ends with you marrying her, Chelsea said. Of course, but it did take a long time to get to that point. I must have proposed 12 times. She wanted to go to college, but of course, a poor boy from the Bay couldn't hope to afford a big state school like her. So, I figured sooner or later, I was likely to be drafted, so I decided to enlist in the Navy instead, and beat the draft board to the punch. This was back in 1968, so Angel went off to college in Berkeley, and I was sent to Vietnam. That must have been hard, Chelsea said as she changed Mr. Marshall's IV. It was. Those were troubled times, at home and overseas. I thought going into the Navy, I would avoid the worst of it, but I was wrong. I spent 2 tours of duty on a riverboat, going up and down the country, seeing far more action than I thought I would. Angel and I wrote to one another every week, and for a little while, it was touch and go. I was unsure if I was coming home. She wasn't sure she wanted to wait around for me, so I let her go and thought that was the last of it. Was it? Chelsea asked. For a little while, yes. I decided to make a career out of the Navy. What else was I going to do when I got back to the States? Certainly not pump gas for the rest of my life. Angel eventually graduated, married, had a child, and worked in some big accounting firm for the next 10 years. Finally, out of the blue, while visiting my mother in the hospital, there she was. She was also visiting her mother in the same hospital. Don't tell me you two started having an affair. That would not make me happy at all, Mr. Marshall. Oh, good lord, no. Even I was not that ballsy. No, we just caught up and had a good time remembering the old days. She told me stories of her life, I told her stories of mine. And then, we went our separate ways, only now exchanging numbers. As Mr. Marshall continued his story, Chelsea suddenly began to feel very sick, to the point that the color in her face seemed to wash away. We frequently spoke over the next couple of years. Her marriage eventually came to an end, and I retired from the Navy. It was around that time that we thought it might be worth giving us another try. He stopped his story as he saw Chelsea's worsening condition. Are you okay, dear? You look horrible. I'm not feeling very well. Would you mind if I pick this story up on my next rounds? Chelsea asked. Of course. Take care of yourself. I'm not going anywhere, Marshall replied. Chelsea left the room, rushing so quickly to the nearest bathroom that she almost crashed into the chief surgeon. Sorry, she called out, darting into the bathroom. The second she reached the toilet, She threw up. She remained sitting on the bathroom floor for a good 5 minutes, trying to catch her breath. "Chelsea?" The voice of the chief surgeon said as he walked into the unisex bathroom. "Yes, doctor?" Chelsea said. Chelsea flushed the toilet and exited the stall before walking over to the sink to wash her hands and face. "I'm sorry, Dr. Wells. I don't know what's gotten into me," Chelsea said. "It's quite all right." "How long have you been feeling this way?" Wells asked. He began to take a closer look at Chelsea, touching her skin and looking into her eyes to see if anything was wrong with her. "Just today, these past couple hours," she replied. "Well, you are a little warm. Your color seems to be coming back. You're not pregnant, are you?" "Oh, Lord, no!" "At least, I don't think I am," she replied. "It could just be a bug you picked up. I did just come from my grandmother's retirement home this morning. I probably got it there," Chelsea theorized. "Perhaps. Anyways, I think you should head home and take the rest of the day off," Wells suggested. "That isn't necessary. I'm starting to feel better. I think I can finish my shift." "No, I want you to go home and rest. We have plenty of staff on hand today. Someone else can tend to your patients. Go home. I'll see you in the morning if you're feeling better." "Okay. Thank you, doctor." After collecting her things, Chelsea decided against taking the bus home, and instead wanted to walk. Even though it was still raining and quite cold, it didn't bother her. She hoped the chilled air might cool her down as her temperature continued to fluctuate. Chelsea's home was her parents' place, an opulent mansion located on Yerba Buena Island, across the land bridge connected to Treasure Island. The estate was quite large for such a small area, with several more modest mansions dominating the affluent neighborhood. The Bay Bridge loomed overhead, jetting through the fog towards San Francisco, which she could barely make out between the white haze. She had to climb up several steep hills to reach the borders of her family's home, choosing to use the side entrance over the main gate, which brought her around to the back where an artistically shaped swimming pool, big enough for a high school swim team to use, was. The home was ultra-modern, with squared construction and large windows that looked less like glass than a natural extension of the walls itself, allowing no one to look inside, but giving a magnificent view from within. To Chelsea, this was a symbol of her parents' little empire, as both her father and mother ran one of the most dominant and profitable real estate agencies in the city. To both, image and status were everything, and this house was a monument to their success. Opening the side door, Chelsea wanted to be quiet. Her parents typically noticed she was home, but she did not want to see either of them today. No such luck. "Chelsea, I thought you had to work," Nancy Trader said. Her mother, slightly startled as she turned the corner from the kitchen area and nearly bumped right into her daughter. "I was sent home," Chelsea replied. "Sent home? Were you fired?" Ted Trader, Chelsea's father, spoke up as he walked into the room following his wife. His head was buried in his cell phone, but the man had proven to be a world-class multitasker. "No, I was not fired, Ted. It is father, dear," Nancy said. Chelsea rolled her eyes. She had taken to calling her dad by his first name over these past 8 months, which irritated her mother to no end. "Don't you have people to take care of? They don't just send a nurse home unless you did something wrong," Ted said. "Oh dear, you didn't get someone killed, did you, honey?" "Good Lord, Mom! No! I did not get someone killed. If you want to know, I'm a little sick and Dr. Wells sent me home," Chelsea said. "Is what you do so unimportant that you would be sent home with the sniffles?" "Ted," Nancy barked. "I'm only asking," he replied. "You know what?" Chelsea paused, her head now throbbing so bad that she could not bring herself to finish her thought. "Yes, dear?" Nancy asked. "Forget it. I'm going to my room to get some rest." Chelsea surged forward, knocking a stack of papers off the table as she reached the stairs and stomped up to her room. Chelsea reached her room, turning the radio on before collapsing on her bed. She wanted to get out of her uniform. However, she felt as if all her energy had been zapped. All she wanted to do was sleep. While asleep, Chelsea thought she was underwater, swimming in an endless black void everywhere. Strange sounds, haunted voices of a million souls, all talking at once. She wanted to scream, but not a word left her mouth. Finally, the sounds became more explicit. Right away, she wished she did not understand, as the voice was demonic and terrifying. "They hurt us. They always hurt us. So much pain. They never believe in us. Just give us more pain," it said over and over. Chelsea tried to scream and block the voice, but nothing dimmed the ferocity of its word. No matter what she did, "We should head them back," it shouted. Chelsea woke, rising to her feet in one motion. She was covered in sweat, that she felt as if she'd been pulled from the pool. Running over to the mirror, She stared at her reflection, barely able to recognize the girl that looked back at her. What is wrong with me? She asked. She turned her music up louder, hoping that would lessen the sounds that beat inside her skull.
Everyone hurts us,
it said again.
Shut up!
Chelsea said, bashing the palms of her hand against her head.
No one deserves us. They hurt and hurt and hurt. Shut up! We have to hurt them first. Shut up!
Chelsea went mad, tossing things from her bookshelves, raking the mirror, while clawing at her walls, bashing her fist over and over.
You are a worthless child. I should have had a son. At least he would not have been such a disappointment.
The voice of her father sounded in her mind. Why can't you be an ordinary girl, like the ones at school? Her mother said.
You are worthless and weak. You give up too quickly. Because of that, you'll never accomplish anything of worth.
Honey, you could be so pretty if you allowed yourself.
Look at you. You're wasting your life away helping sick people who couldn't possibly help you in return. How pathetic.
A boy will never want to marry you looking like that.
What is that crap in your hair? Are you a prostitute now?
Why can't you be more like your father? He is driven and ambitious.
You've accomplished nothing. You'll be nothing.
Chelsea couldn't take it anymore as she collapsed onto her knees, screaming.
What the hell is going on in there? Don't you know I'm trying to work?
Ted said as he burst through the door.
What in Christ's sake is wrong with you? Look at this goddamn mess, little girl!
Chelsea said nothing. She remained still.
Do you hear me? Look at me when I'm talking to you!
Ted grabbed Chelsea by the shoulder and tried to pull her up. He did not have to, as Chelsea rose to her feet and turned to face her father.
My lord! What is wrong with you?
He said, his voice quivering in terror as Chelsea's eyes glowed, and her skin cracked as if something underneath wanted to burst out. She grabbed her father's hand, which was still on her shoulder, and tugged. The man said nothing at first, as the shock of what happened settled in. He looked down at Chelsea. She held something in her hand once she pulled away from him. It didn't seem to dawn on him at first that what she was holding was a bloody stump that was his arm. Not until he glanced over at his shoulder and saw she'd torn the thing clean off at the joint.
What's wrong, Daddy?
Chelsea asked, her voice otherworldly. Her father collapsed to his knees as the realization of what just happened to him set in. A terrifying scream filled the house from behind him as Chelsea's mother was standing in the doorway. Grabbing her father by his neck, Chelsea ripped out his throat as her fingers clamped down on the soft flesh. Ted gargled as blood poured from his throat before he fell over, landing on the edge of Chelsea's bed, and bled out, his body twitching violently. Nothing to say to me now, do you? Chelsea said to her father before he died. Nancy continued to scream, turning from her daughter, and ran. Oh, Mother, Chelsea said with a wicked smile as she gave chase. Nancy screamed frantically. She ran downstairs, racing through the halls, trying to get away from her daughter. But each time she looked back, Chelsea was right there. Then she felt something strike her, which caused her to fall forward and land face first on the hardwood floor. Nancy looked back and saw the severed stump of her husband's hand lying next to her as Chelsea threw the body part at her from across the hall. You two have always been inseparable, Chelsea said. Nancy struggled back to her feet, but could not get very far before she was grabbed by Chelsea and tossed 15 feet through the air, crashing through a stack of wine bottles that had been among Ted's pride and joy. Nancy could not get back to her feet, falling several times as liquor covered her body, and countless shards of broken glass had pierced her skin. She crawled and managed to reach the garage. Her right leg was broken. Nancy looked up at the gun locker that was set against the opposite wall. She crawled to it, leaving a long streak of blood and wine, which mixed until it was indistinguishable. Chelsea was behind her, now slowing her pace as she watched her mother struggle to reach the gun cabinet, which would have been futile even if she had the strength to stand, as the cabinet was locked. Reaching down, Chelsea grabbed a fistful of her mother's hair and lifted her off the floor, where she dangled like a fish caught on the line. Please, Nancy struggled to say. Am I pretty now, Mother? Chelsea asked. Before her mother could utter another word, Chelsea bashed her skull down on the hood of the car. The first impact did not kill her, as the side of her face split open. But on the third, she was dead, as bits and pieces of her head came loose under Chelsea's grip as she continued to thrash her mother's head into the car. Finally, when hardly anything was left of her mother, Chelsea stood back. She felt powerful and felt connected to everything. She felt her mind reach out to others that she'd connected with and called them to wake up with her. None of you deserve this world, Chelsea said in a low, guttural voice. Dr. Juliet Wu, Half Moon Bay, California. Dr. Wu rode in the back seat of a black government SUV. It drove slowly through the perimeter the Highway Patrol had set up around the Voyager Dawn crash site. A mob had gathered, along with a dozen news outlets, as word had reached them about the beached ship. Without answers, the media speculated on what happened. During the flight to California, Wu read up on the CIA's report on the Pangu Virus. She was aware of it, and what the Chinese military had done with it years ago. Using an earlier weaponized version on their people, she had advised the president back then of the need to get our hands on a virus sample. What little information had been smuggled out frightened her. It would appear the Defense Department finally listened. However, they failed to advise her and the C.E.R.C. of the operation, where she could have given them greater insight on how to transport the sample back to the United States properly. Their hubris, as usual, got the better of them, and now it was up to her agency to clean up the mess. Wu's vehicle stopped on the road that overlooked the Voyager Dawn beaching site. Standing outside her car was Dr. Victoria Kira, a former viral researcher for the World Health Organization, until Dr. Wu recruited her. The woman was brilliant, resourceful, and professional. Her natural good looks were the only thing that seemed to get in her way. Men tended to do a double take when she entered a room, which only served to irritate Kira to no end, as she prized her abilities and mind above anything else. Dr. Kira walked over to Wu. An umbrella was held out for Wu to take as she exited the vehicle. "Look at this. What a mess," Wu said. "Indeed, Doctor. I'm afraid it is much worse inside the ship," Kira replied. The two women stood next to the highway guardrail and looked down at the cargo ship that had come to rest on the beach. It listed 60 degrees to the ship's port side. "How many?" Wu asked. 16 crew members, all dead, including 4 Navy SEALs. However, 2 crew members, including one of the SEALs, died from injuries sustained during the storm, Kira reported. "Why did those fools go through the storm while carrying the worst virus we've ever discovered instead of around it?" Wu asked. "They tried. Langley wanted the samples back in the U.S. as quickly as possible. The Chinese are not too thrilled about the attack on their island either. They're making quite the fuss about it," Kira answered. "Covering their ass, more like it. If this gets out, China will ensure everyone knows they kept the virus locked away, safe, and far from any civilian population. Damn the fact they weaponized the thing in the first place," Wu said. Wu turned away from the Voyager Dawn and said, "All right, let me see them." The two women walked down the shoulder of the road until they came to a long series of trailers with CERC markings on the sides. Inside, the containers were broken into segments of independent rooms filled with medical equipment. Glass barriers separated each room, which was currently occupied. They arrived on the scene when the discovery of the Voyager Dawn was made. Wu stood, looking into the first examination room. A police officer named Nick Holmes was strapped down onto a bed, wearing a medical gown. He was shaking uncontrollably, as if he was cold. Despite the fact that he was sweating buckets, his skin had turned ashen gray, and all of his veins jutted against his skin were bright purple. His eyes were bloodshot and yellow. Blood drizzled from his eyes, nose, and mouth. "This man was first on the scene?" Wu asked. "He was. Officer Nicholas Holmes, California Highway Patrol. 8 years on the job. He had direct contact with the woman who called in the Voyager Dawn, Chelsea Trader." "Did the rest of these people have contact with her?" "Some of them, yes. Others appear to have gotten sick from direct contact with Officer Holmes." "This isn't right. The virus is progressing too quickly. Why aren't they dead already?" Wu asked. More to herself than to Dr. Kira, Wu pressed the receiver button on the side of the wall and spoke. "Officer Holmes, I'm Dr. Juliet Wu, Director of the Center for Epidemic Research and Control. Can you understand me?" Officer Holmes did his best to turn his head and speak, but words seemingly could not be formed, or it was too painful to try to talk. Nevertheless, Wu could tell from his eyes that he was lucid enough to understand what she was saying. "My word," Kira said as she looked at Officer Holmes more carefully. "Those growths, do they look like coral to you?" "Those weren't there when I left to meet you, Doctor." Wu studied what Kira was referring to. It did appear that some kind of hard coral-like substance had broken through Officer Holmes' skin, around his neck and left shoulder. "I want you to know that we're doing everything we can to help you, but I need to know more about what happened when you arrived. From your report, you indicated that there was a girl who was first on the scene. Chelsea Trader?" Officer Holmes nodded. "Yes." "Very good. Can you remember for me, did Miss Trader look ill to you in any way? Bloodshot eyes, bleeding from her orifices, or any unusual behavior?" The officer shook his head. "No." "Are you certain?" Wu asked. He nodded yes. "How long between the first 911 call and when Officer Holmes arrived at the scene?" Wu asked Kira. 8 minutes. "And how long before Officer Holmes and the others first began showing signs of infection?" "Within the first hour. The police questioned Ms. Trader for over an hour before she could go. She should have shown some signs of infection by then. Kira said, "Are you certain, officer, that Miss Trader did not appear sick to you in any way?" Wu asked. He nodded yes again. Just then, Officer Holmes began to convulse violently, his mouth opening wide as a strange and inhuman sound cried out. Unfortunately, he was not the only one, as Dr. Wu and Kira witnessed each patient react the same way. They fought against their restraints as their eyes bulged and their behavior became aggressively violent. Both Wu and Kira could not help but step back out of fear as the man they talked to no longer seemed or acted human. Reacting to what? Kira asked. I don't know, but something has changed. Wu turned to Kira and said, "We need to find Chelsea Trader." Dr. Noah Wells. Dr. Wells yawned before he picked up his coffee cup and finished what his third helping was, dissatisfied when he realized there was not any more. He looked down the hall from his office towards the break room, knowing that a full pot was more than likely made. Shannon's going to kill me, he said to himself before siding against his better judgment and walked down the hall with his empty cup in hand. His wife had gotten on his case over the past few months about the amount of caffeine he consumes. Not that she was one to talk, but naturally, she expected him to follow her example since she'd started her new diet. Honestly, he tried. But with long shifts and a busy workday, it was not easy to keep his mind focused on his job when the Sandman came knocking. I hope this coffee's hot and fresh, Wells said before he walked into the break room, half expecting one or more nurses to be in there. Oh well, more for me, I guess. The pot was filled to the top, but when Wells grabbed it, he was surprised to find the coffee was cold. It had probably been sitting there for the past couple of hours. A cardinal sin in a busy hospital, with overworked staff who also needed the extra boost to keep them awake and functional. Wells shrugged his shoulders, figuring whoever made it probably had to run off and take care of some emergency. So, he poured himself a cup and stuck it in the microwave before grabbing the creamer out of the refrigerator and a single packet of sugar. As he waited for the timer to reach 0, he turned sharply as he thought he heard something heavy crash onto the floor down the hall. Standing in the doorway, he listened again. There was a loud beeping noise, but that was about it. Is everything okay? He called out. As Wells stepped out of the break room, there was no answer, and took a couple steps down the hall, listening carefully. The microwave timer beeped, which startled Wells, causing him to jump as his nerves had gotten the better of him. He turned to go back inside the break room when he heard a high-pitched scream from a woman. Hello? Is everything okay? Wells turned and rushed down the hall, knowing this wasn't the typical scream he was used to hearing from a patient. This was primal, like a person would sound like in a horror movie. As he turned the corner, he saw a nurse attacking a woman who struggled against him, her feet slipping in a pool of blood. Hey! Wells ran forward, stopping in his tracks when he laid eyes on the man that held the woman. Oh my God. Wells covered his mouth, mortified when he saw the male nurse tearing into the woman's throat with his teeth. She, unable to speak. She was still alive, looking over at Wells with teary eyes, begging for him to help without words. Wells grabbed a fire extinguisher that hung on the wall and dashed over to the nurse, bashing the extinguisher against the back of his skull. The nurse turned, letting go of his victim as he stared up at Wells with a face covered with blood. His eyes were yellow, terrifying, and seemed no longer human. Wells struck the nurse again as he lunged at him. The nurse's face split open as a mouthful of teeth spilled across the floor. This did not faze him as the attacker turned and tried to rush Wells again. This time, Wells hit the man harder, knocking the nurse to the ground. He did not stop there, as he continued to bash the fire extinguisher down onto the man's head until his skull caved in and brains spilled out over the floor. Wells breathed heavily as he slipped in the pool of blood, falling against the wall. He then realized the woman was still alive as she lay on the floor, looking up at him, her mouth moving as she tried to say something, but could not. Wells crawled over to her and looked for anything he could use to stop the bleeding, ultimately deciding his lab coat was the best choice. Removing it, he shoved it against the woman's throat, which pulsated with streams of blood that squirted out. Someone help me! Wells tried to lift the woman to her feet. She was too heavy, almost dead weight. He continued to lose his grip and slipped in the blood several times. The woman clutched his collar as she was in shock, struggling to speak before her eyes rolled back into her head and her body convulsing. Wells cried out again, but once more, no one heard him. When he felt the woman go limp, he realized she was dead. Wells covered his mouth, mortified by what happened once he laid her down on the floor. It was then that he heard more screams coming from down the hall. He panicked, hiding behind a workstation as a nurse ran past him. She was covered in blood, and her arm appeared to be mangled. 2 men chasing after her, both patients still wearing their hospital gowns. Wells noted the same monstrous appearance in their eyes, as they were more like crazed beasts than men. When he got the nerve, he stood up, ran back to his office, and shut the door before closing the blinds. He reached for his cell phone, which was on the top of his desk, and frantically tried to dial for help. However, there was no signal. Grabbing the landline, Wells dialed again. The phone rang twice before a woman answered. 911, how can I help you?
Hello, my name is Noah Wells. I am the chief surgeon at Treasure Island Memorial Hospital. Something strange is happening here. The patients and nurses, they've all gone mad, murdering each other.
Sir? I don't understand, the operator said. Please catch your breath and speak as clearly as you can.
They're murdering people! I don't know what's going on or why. You need to send the police here. The SWAT, the army, I don't give a damn. Something very wrong is happening.
We have units on the way, sir. I advise you stay where you are as long as you are safe. Don't try what?
Hello? Hello, are you there?
Wells tried to dial again, but this time there was no signal. Another loud crash sounded, followed by frantic screaming. A moment later, he heard gunshots, 6 in total. Wells crawled under his desk before reaching for a nearby golf club. He crouched down, holding onto his weapon, and waited for the violence to stop. More gunshots echoed down the halls, followed by a feral screaming. There was more running. There was more screaming. After about 30 minutes, the halls were silent once more that Wells decided he could not stay where he was a moment longer. His instincts told him to find a way out of the hospital as he feared one of those things would discover him. Quietly, he moved to his door and unlocked it, slowly opening it and peeking through the crack. He saw a dead body down the hall, another nurse, but he heard nothing else. Wells, with a golf club in hand, moved quickly out of his office. He was on the 4th floor and thought it was best to work his way down instead of up. Slowly, he made his way over to the elevator, but decided against using it. He was unsure if there were any more of those things on this floor that might be close enough to hear it, so instead, he moved into a low crouch over to the stairs. Heading down, Wells heard more fighting and screaming coming from the 3rd floor. A large pool of blood spilled under the access door to this level, indicating that he had to keep going down and dare not venture outside to see what was happening. He stopped, however, when he came across the first set of bodies. At least half a dozen victims were on the floor, some of them with broken necks, clearly trampled when patients and staff rushed down the stairs to escape. As he reached the 2nd floor, he kept going before realizing the stairs leading to the 1st floor were filled with the dead. He struggled to control his breathing and thought if he should continue down. He hated the thought of having to step over people he knew, as more than a few of the victims were hospital staff he was friends with. Ultimately, he decided it was best to try his luck on the 2nd floor. There was another set of stairs on the east side of the level. Maybe they would not be blocked, he hoped. Wells walked out onto the 2nd floor of the hospital. He found more bodies, all of them savagely torn to pieces. He even found a few dead police officers and hospital security guards that rushed upstairs. They had run headlong into something they weren't prepared for. Wells turned when he caught out of the corner of his eye someone charged at him. Wells recognized Fred Douglas, an X-ray technician he had shared a few lunches with over the years working together. He was a nice man, as big a football fan as Wells had ever known. He had a wife and 3 kids, 2 of whom he was putting through college. Despite this knowledge, none of it stopped Wells as he swung his golf club across Fred's face the moment he saw the murderous rage in his eyes. Fred flew over the table as he crashed onto the floor, but quickly sprung back to his feet despite the deep gash in the right side of his face. The 2 men fell to the floor with Fred on top of Wells. Wells used his golf club to keep Fred from ripping into his throat as the man savagely snapped at him with his teeth.
Help me! Someone help me!
Wells screamed. He felt his strength start to waver as his friend was about to sink his teeth into his throat. Blood splashed on Wells' face as he realized something was thrust into the back of Fred's skull, pushing Fred off him once his body went limp. Wells saw a woman holding a mop handle, which she broke to create a makeshift spear. "Come on, take my hand, we haven't much time," the woman said as she held out her hand for Wells to take. He did, without question, as she helped him back to his feet. He realized he knew 5 other people with her, a doctor and a nurse from the 5th floor, and 2 civilians, most likely visitors or hospital employees. More of the crazed infected came rushing around the corner.
Run!
The woman said. The group turned and ran in the opposite direction as quickly as they could. However, it was difficult getting around all the overturned tables, medical supplies, and hospital beds, all of which had been purposefully moved into the middle of the halls. Wells realized the girl that was saving him was trying to lead the group to the far stairwell. He quickly realized that they were not going to make it.
Wait! This way!
Wells called out. The group didn't argue as they stopped in their tracks and ran after Wells, who dashed into a part of the hospital where they stored blood and plasma. The infected were right behind them when Wells grabbed hold of the door handle that led into the freezer. He pulled the door open and urged everyone to run inside before he followed and quickly slammed the door just as the infected reached him. The infected began bashing at the door, and for a moment, Wells wondered if they knew how to open it. However, after the first 3 minutes, everyone began to calm down. When they realized they did not understand how to open the freezer, Wells carefully made sure the door was secure before turning to the group of survivors who had found him. One of them seemed severely injured, and the rest were afraid out of their minds. Already, they were beginning to shiver. "It's going to be cold, but at least I don't think those things know how to get in here," Wells said. "I hope so," the woman that saved him said. "You have any idea how to get out of here? The hospital, I mean?" she asked. "At the moment, I think it's our best bet to stay where we are. I managed to call 911 before I left my office. Hopefully, there's already an army of cops outside, ready to storm the hospital. If we stay in here and wait for rescue, I think we should be okay." Wells tried to sound as reassuring as he could. He wasn't sure he believed himself, but it was the best idea anyone had come up with. At least, it was a hell of a lot better in the freezer than out there trying to avoid the beast, he thought to himself. Until then, Wells looked over to his fellow doctor. "Amber, let us help this man with his injuries. Everyone else, look around and try and find if there's anything we can use to stay warm." The woman that saved Wells grabbed his arm to pull his attention towards her. "That was quick thinking on your part to come in here, even if it's cold as hell. It isn't a problem. Besides, it is I who should be thanking you, Miss..." "Rachel's fine. Thank you, Rachel." "Do you have any idea what's going on here?" Rachel asked. "I don't. I'm sorry to say. I was visiting a friend on the 3rd floor. He was supposed to be dying from cancer and could barely walk as it was. No less attacked me as he did. I didn't know what to do. A couple of the nurses pulled him off me, but the look in his eyes as he turned and attacked them, it wasn't human," Wells said, finishing Rachel's sentence. "You shouldn't think about it. You might be in here for a little while. Please help the others." "Sure. And thanks again, Dr. Noah Wells. A pleasure to meet you." We was on a video conference as 2 outraged men stared with a trace of bitterness she had experienced one too many times in her long career. Neither man, the mayor of San Francisco and the police commissioner, liked what she just demanded. "I don't care what it takes. I want all access on and off that island to be locked down tighter than Fort Knox," Dr. Wu said. Just an hour ago, she watched as all those people who had contact with Chelsea traders suddenly and very violently became something else entirely. Their bodies mutating rapidly as their minds became feral and their actions hostile. It was unlike anything she had ever seen before, as some animalistic desire took root, turning ordinary men into vicious monsters. To spread the virus through physical contact. It must be its goal, like a zombie, she had thought at the time. She would have laughed at how ridiculous the notion was if she hadn't seen it with her own 2 eyes. But then came word that something similar happened on Treasure Island, in a hospital where she learned Chelsea Trader worked.
Are you crazy? I just sent 3 dozen officers to that hospital 20 minutes ago. I can't close the island and leave those men there to deal with whatever the hell is happening on their own.
Commissioner Rowe said. "And I agree, Doctor. If this is as bad as you claim, then I need to get control of that island as soon as possible before this outbreak spreads to the city," Mayor Loeb said. "This is exactly what I'm trying to stop, Mr. Mayor. Nevertheless, as authorized by the President of the United States, the C.E.R.C. has full authority to do as we need to control this crisis," Wu said bluntly. "Now, close the Bay Bridge and order the Coast Guard to set up a naval blockade of both Treasure Island and Yerba Buena Island before I find someone else to do it for you. Am I understood?" Wu demanded. Both men were silent for a long while. "I don't like it, and I will have to talk to the governor, Dr. Wu. But for the time being, I will do as you ask," Mayor Loeb said.
Mr. Mayor! My men will be trapped on that island fighting something we don't have a fucking clue what it is!
The police commissioner said. "That's why I can't risk the lives of 8 million people. Do what Dr. Wu has asked. Do try to understand, both of you. I will do everything in my agency's power to end this crisis as quickly as I can. The effort will go a lot smoother now and in the future if I can trust that I have your full support. You do, Doctor. Commissioner Rowe finally agreed. Protecting the people of San Francisco is my only priority, Doctor. Do whatever you need to ensure this outbreak doesn't spread, Mayor Loeb said. Dr. Wu sighed heavily as she ended the call. One crisis of egos averted. Sadly, there are always other fish who think they are sharks, Wu thought to herself. Pilot, what is the ETA of my strike team? Wu asked. Their transport is 5 minutes out, Doctor, the pilot said. Dr. Wu looked out the window of her helicopter as it passed just outside the Coast Guard perimeter set up around Treasure Island. She could not see anything too alarming at this time. Police lights did flash all over the island as public traffic was beginning to back up. She knew for the time, law and order would be maintained. However, if what she feared came true, it would not be long before the virus spread among the population. Those not infected would do everything in their power to get off the island. With 2 major cities filled with millions of people just a stone's throw away from Treasure Island, she feared what it would mean if the Pangu Virus reached a major population center. I should have stayed with the CDC, Wu thought, a joking comment she had said many times in private over the past 2 years. Her chopper banked, coming through the fog and heading towards Alcatraz Island. The former prison turned national park was being transformed into the CERC's base of operation. She was impressed by the spread of her agency's logistics. She had made sure the equipment needed would be placed in critical locations around the country, kept at local National Guard depots, so the CERC could quickly react and contain the outbreak if a crisis were to happen. Of course, not everyone was happy about it, hence the next phone call she got. Mr. Governor, I'm sorry if it seems like I've been dodging your calls, but as you might be aware, I'm faced with a growing epidemic in San Francisco, Wu said. Dr. Wu, I'm not pleased with the aggressive tactics your agency has taken. I have the mayor of San Francisco calling me every 10 minutes, and now I have the head of Federal Park Service complaining that you've turned Alcatraz into your fortress, Governor Blair said. My fortress? Hardly, Mr. Governor. I needed to remind you that Alcatraz is federal property, and it is perfectly within my authority to seize any federal land I might need. Alcatraz is the closest island near the outbreak's epicenter. Thus, the need for this location to be converted to the CERC's needs, Wu said. Nevertheless, you are playing with fire, Doctor. Playing, Mr. Governor? A poor choice of words. I am sorry, Doctor, but you catch my meaning nonetheless. You need state and local assistance to combat this outbreak as your agency has few allies in D.C. willing to put their neck out on the line if things should turn sideways. I would advise, Dr. Wu, you try to be more accommodating to those on the ground and do everything in your power to keep them in the loop. Wu was ready to bark back at the governor, but decided it was best to hold her tongue. She was too early in the operation to already be dealing with bureaucratic red tape. Everyone wanted to cover their asses. The governor was right about one thing. There were too many disgruntled senators back in D.C. who wished to see the CERC fail. I understand, Governor, and thank you for your advice, Wu said after a short pause as she tried to keep her calm. She ignored everything else the man had to say over the next 2 minutes, as she felt as if he was talking down to her. If the outbreak was averted and lives saved, he would take credit for saving San Francisco. If she failed, then the blame could always be shifted to the CERC. Wu knew she had a trump card, a little-known bylaw, that she could enact to give her and the CERC absolute authority even over the civilian government. But that was only authorized in the distress of circumstances, which conditions had not been met. Yes, Mr. Governor, I will make sure that your office is kept informed every step of the way. Hopefully, this crisis will be concluded in a few hours, Wu said, her mind barely paying attention. Very well, Dr. Wu, he replied, choosing to hang up on her, following his last words. Prick, Wu said as the call was dropped. Dr. Wu, the strike team has landed, the pilot said. Very good. Send me down in the courtyard. Roger that.